This is Brett Weinstein.
This is Tom Luongo.
This is Bruce Party.
This is Alex Kreiner.
Hey, this is Brad Wall.
This is Dr. Pierre Corey.
Hi, this is Frank Peretti.
This is Danielle Smith.
This is James Lindsay.
This is Vance Crowe, and you're listening to the Shaun Newman Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast, folks. Happy Thursday. How's everybody doing today? This is interesting. I'm sitting at Jasmine Lane's house right now. Obviously, you're not going to hear that episode for a couple of days, but regardless, I'm just getting ready to chat with her. So that's a little foresight into what's coming on the podcast here in the next week. Before we get into where we're at here, life on the road, let's start with a little silver gold bull, shall we? Whether buying, selling, storing precious metals, whether you're Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, or maybe some other steps along the way, wherever you hang your hat. Of course, they service all of you. Go to silvergoldbull.ca. It's all online. You click there, you register an account, you purchase, and it ships right to your doorstep. Super slick. You may have noticed their gold in Costco. And yeah, they supply all of Costco. If you're down in the States, silvergoldbull.com. Regardless, it's super easy. Down in the show notes, you can text or email Grahame for details with any questions you have around investing in precious metals or anything else for that matter. He's always excited to talk to all of you. Guardian Plumbing and Heating, these guys have been keeping homes, farms, and businesses running smoothly since 2010. You know, whether it's expert service, cutting-edge power solutions, or advice you can trust, Guardian Plumbing and Heating has your back. And you can find them at guardianplumbing.ca. They're based out of my hometown of Lloydminster, but they certainly go further out than that. They seem to be always on the road. And if you've got problems, they've got solutions. So guardianplumbing.ca. And Wainwright, Alberta, Ignite Distribution. They're a high-service supply company based, once again, in Wainwright, Alberta, specializing in automotive parts and a wide range of additional products, including safety equipment, welding supplies, fasteners, and janitorial items, operating as a Napa Auto Parts retailer. And they've got all the supplies you can need to keep your business running. And you can give them a call, 780-842-3433. You can stop in, too, and see Shane Stafford and his team. They'll get you taken care of. Caleb Taves and the Renegade Acres, they did the stamped concrete in the new studio. And, of course, when it comes to Renegade Acres, they've put in the community spotlight. And here I sit in, once again, Jasmine Lane's house, recording the intro for Thursday's interview. I've spent the day in Winnipeg, and we're still in Grand Beach for the next day and a half. I'll be recording the mashup out of Grand Beach Campground, so that should be a lot of fun. And we're just looking forward to a day at the beach on Thursday. If I'm being honest, we've been pushing the show pretty hard. I've been all over the place, and looking forward to. I mean, it's like 38 above here right now. It's hot. It's humid. But, I don't care what Manitobans say, folks. There's hardly any mosquitoes that I've seen. I'll probably eat my words tonight. But it has been, it's been an awesome little trip into Manitoba, and just appreciative of every Manitoban that has, sat and had a conversation with me. I got to bump into Lee, so shout out to Lee and Kathy. Sat and had a conversation with them at their place while I was in Winnipeg. Got to run into an old teammate of mine from Dryden days, Brendan McDonald, so shout out to him. We sat and had lunch together, and that was awesome to catch up, and it's just been an enjoyable day in Winnipeg, running around, grabbing a couple interviews and seeing a few people I haven't seen for quite some time. Now, the S&P road trip is powered by Zeebs, a family-owned and fine-tuned in Chestermere, Alberta. Zeebs Performance Restoration delivers expert classic car restorations and custom exhausts and performance upgrades that keep your ride reliable and roaring. I think Lee and Kathy can agree. When the old Black Beast came rolling in, she was a roaring. Any upgrades you need, visit zeebs.ca and find Zane and Brian. Now, if you're listening on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, Substack, make sure to subscribe. Make sure to leave a review. If you enjoy the interview today, make sure that you share with a friend. And if you haven't subscribed or signed up on Substack, you really should. We got the Week in Review there. We got Tanner Naday's masterclass talking about the life of Paul. That's releasing over the next couple months. So that's a lot of fun. And that's for paid members. So you got to be a paid member to support the show to find the masterclass. But there's a whole bunch of freebies in there too if you want to follow along with what's going on the road and everything else. All right, let's get on to that tale of the tape. Today's guest is the owner of Sundance Construction. I'm talking about Jocelyn Burzuik. So buckle up. Here we go. Welcome to the Shaun Newman Podcast. Today I'm joined by Jocelyn Burzuik. It's cool to finally meet you. We've had in my opinion, a wonderful day because I got to come here earlier, brought Mel and the kids, and certainly, I'm sure at times they're like, what is Shaun taking us to, or what is Dad taking us to, right?
Yeah.
But I got to see your development and what you're working on, and kind of, just see where you call home, and, and be in front of the Sundance construction sign, and kind of, I've interviewed you virtually while you've sat here. So this is pretty cool. So first off, thanks for doing this and being here and hopping on and everything else.
Oh, I'm loving it. I'm so happy. I was actually looking forward to you guys coming out for a long time.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. We just because when we're online and we're talking and I looked at it, we started talking in 2022.
I know.
So we started talking in 22.
Somebody suggested this Sundance construction Twitter handle, and I was like, sure, what are they talking about? And at that time, it was your dealings with the government and whistleblowing and everything else. But it's X has been a really interesting thing, and once upon a time Twitter, now X, of how many people I've met through there. When people have something to say and they only have a short span to say it to catch people's attention, those people stand out. I mean, obviously everybody knows Twos. That's how me and him got hooked up, and he's become a fixture of the podcast every week, breaking down Canadian headlines. But it led me to people like Sundance Construction, which I later learned was Jocelyn, and everything else from it,
Yeah, and I love that. And I never understood the importance of being able to talk about what is going on in your in your kind of like your area of the world and in Canada, but to share that that perspective of what you were seeing, because when we first started talking, a lot of the thoughts that I had about what was going on in Manitoba and Canada as a whole, I felt really isolated. Like I felt like, am I the only one that's actually experiencing this? Am I out here on my own? Am I one woman against the world?
And what did we find out? It's like, no, not a chance. Yeah. It's happening everywhere. I tell you what, I've been saying this a lot, but since we're in Manitoba, I'm just going to keep saying it. I would never have thought to come spend time in Manitoba. And then you walking me through the map and everything, I'm sure somebody from Saskatchewan could do the exact same thing. They'd be like, well, head up north into Saskatchewan, and this is what you're going to find. You're going to find beautiful country. But when you come rolling through Manitoba, most of us go to Winnipeg and go straight on through. Very few that I know actually head north or south to see the people. And both sides of it have been super cool. The people have been really interesting and friendly and knowledgeable. There's a ton of history in Manitoba, which I was kind of not surprised about. It's just when you actually sit here and start talking to people, you're like, oh, I guess I didn't really think about that much.
Manitoba's old, lots of history in Manitoba, and we're the gateway to the West. We were the gateway to the West. And in a lot of ways, we still are the gateway to the West. And so that's kind of where that uniqueness from Manitoba comes from. And I was explaining earlier that in Manitoba, 1 in 4 people are Indigenous. We have Indigenous roots. In Saskatchewan, 1 in 5 are Indigenous. And so there's a real mix of history here.
So let's start with the Indigenous thing. That me and you have been talking off air about this, right? The 215 graves and everything that's come out about it has spurred on a lot of things across. X is probably the lightning rod that me and you see.
Yep.
You've had your thoughts on that.
Yep.
Well, let's hear them.
So in terms of the grave settings and the excavations at Kamloops, what happened, and this is what I've been trying to explain to people, is that our government, the federal government, looked at what had just gone. Now, we just had the change in government, right? So we'd had the change of government. It was now a Trudeau government. He went out there and said, yes, I'm going to embrace truth and reconciliation. I'm going to embrace all the recommendations from truth and reconciliation. Yes, genocide occurred. Yes, all those things occurred. And he went laser focused into places like Kamloops. And that's not what Kamloops started off as. And Indigenous people, and friends of mine who are both First Nations, either status or non-status, or other Métis people, the first thing we said was, is this going to take away from the real issues that were with residential schools, the real issues with histories, the real issues with treaty rights, the real issues with self-government. Is this going to take away from that? Because what they did was they laser focused on something that they knew was not solid. They laser focused on one issue, and they did it to the exclusion of every single recommendation that was in Truth and Reconciliation. Truth and Reconciliation was real. Manitoba, 1 in 4 Indigenous. How many of our families were scooped? How many of our families got taken in the 60s scoop? How many of our families experienced real problems, real issues with residential schools that were not day schools on reserve? Tons. A lot of the stories are real. A lot of the experiences are real. But then what happened was that our media and other groups in government, they saw it as an opportunity, and nobody is going to change my mind on this, is that what they did was they co-opted all of those issues. They blew up Kamloops, and they blew up the graves, and they blew up the entire issue of Every Child Matters, which is absolutely true. Every child does matter. Every single child. And that's what I talk about. Every child does matter. But what happened was that we had an absolutely impeccable strategy come out of the federal Liberals. And what was that strategy? How do we weaponize Indigenous issues in Canada and divide? How can we destabilize?
So you think it's interesting to hear you talk or bring it up that way, because you go like, there's a ton of things they could have just went and pointed out, like, this is real, this is real, this is real. Instead, they laser focus on something that is on shoddy ground, to say the least.
Yes.
Then they blow it up.
Yeah.
Going, there's a good chance this blows up in our face and causes divide. Like, am I reading what you're saying correct? Right? We all sit out in the West and go, what the heck is going on? You're sitting there going, listen, there's 1,000 stories they could have went and talked about and showed the truth. Instead, they picked the one where it's shoddy at best, if not all out completely false. And I'm just talking about the 215. I'm not talking about the rest. And you go, and then they continue to push on it, which is going to cause anger, dividing of the two populations.
Yep.
And you see that firsthand, and you go like, they could take 1,000 other stories, and there would be a lot of like truth and reconciliation there. Instead, they picked the one
that would divide.
And that's what we're seeing right now.
Exactly. And so what I saw as everything building up is that if we look at the 2019 federal election, some of the stuff was starting to come out. And then what did we go into a 2021 election after that for a federal election? What happened in between 2015, 2019, 2021? The focus between 2019 2021 became Kamloops. And what they did is that is the time where all of those Indigenous relations, Indigenous issues became weaponized. And it was done for political gain, because what it did was it inflamed people that don't know. It don't know the history. So if you're in Manitoba and you're in Saskatchewan with high Indigenous ratios of population, we all know. We get it. Like we understood what was going on. We understand the nuance. We understand the complexity. We have hundreds of years of history here. We totally got it. We totally understood what we were seeing. But when you go further west, that's not the case. And when you go further east, that's not the case. You have very small percentages of Indigenous as you go that way. And you have a lot of myths. And you have a lot of ideas about Indigenous being freeloaders and all those other things that come along with that. But that's not the actual reality that exists out there. So when I saw the federal government starting to push the strategy down to media and all the way across every mainstream outlet, there was a bunch of us that said, this is bad. This is going to blow up. And this is going to take all that common ground that was being built. Like you look between 2019 and 2021, Pierre Poilievre had done an amazing job at reconciling. He was out there, the Conservative Party was out there, and they were talking to chiefs and councils. They were talking to various Indigenous groups. They were talking to people on the ground. They were talking to grassroots. And so you had a bridging between the Indigenous in Canada and the Conservative Party. We had a bridge that was being built. For the first time in how many years, a real bridge was being built. Common sense issues that are common to Indigenous, to rural Canadians, to urban Canadians, the same issues. We all believe in the same things, same values, same hard work, same ethics, same goals for our children. We want a job, we want land, we want a house, we want a business. And that was taken away. Systematically, since 2021 to today, that gap between Indigenous now and the Conservative Party has been damaged. And it's been damaged incredibly by what's happening in Alberta. And with the idea of separation and those things, the idea of separation for Alberta and self-determination is something that is fundamentally the right to self-determination. That's an Indigenous issue. Right from the get-go. What does every single First Nation in Canada want? Ultimately, what do we want? We want self-determination. We want self-government. We want to have respect. We want to be an equal party at the table. And I don't speak for all Indigenous. I speak for me. I'm a Métis woman, and I have hundreds of years of history here in Manitoba. But I'm speaking from my experiences and my conversations that I'm talking with other Indigenous, and I go all over. And I've showed you how many places that I touch and how many places that how many people I interact with. You've seen the breadth of how big that is. So what I saw it was a deliberate strategy to divide. And when the idea of separation came, and they first started talking about it in Alberta, I saw some good positive messaging that was coming out from Wilson, Keith Wilson. Keith Wilson had some great commentary on it. Eva had some great, Chipiak, is that it?
Chipiak, yeah.
So Eva had some quality comments on that. Keith Wilson had quality comments on that. But then what I saw something very deliberate. And friends of mine, like Indigenous friends that are both First Nation and non-status and Métis, we've looked at some of the conservative influencers that are out there and some of the messages that they're pushing is in BC and in Alberta, and we're like, this looks like a limited hangout to us. This looks like a real limited hangout, because what we're seeing is people that are, promoting the idea of self-determination and separatism and like a new way forward or a new agreement with Western Canada and Ottawa. But the way that they're going about it is so catastrophically wrong that it's blowing my mind.
So let's talk about, I'm trying. One of the things, if you had never heard of Jocelyn Burzuik, is she's going to speak at 100 miles an hour, and I'm going to try and rein her in and slow her down. So let's go back for a second to, before we get to the independence and everything there in the limited hangout, let's go back for a second. You were talking about Pierre and building bridges with First Nations. And you're like, wow, this is actually going to unite us. We have all these common things, and you're seeing a party at the federal level building bridges for the first time in your life, I think is basically what you were saying.
Not in my life, but the first time where the idea of having a conservative government that could bridge the issues with Indigenous people, I think that idea was the first time that it had gone mainstream in decades.
Okay. So when you go back and when you tie that in with, and then they pick Kamloops, instead of picking things that would have made sense in your mind, you're like, man, we're sitting here and we're going, why are they picking that one?
Yeah.
Because it's going to blow up the way it has.
Yeah.
Now you have the Francis Widdowson and, I'm spacing on probably a whole bunch of other names. Francis just comes really to top of mind, but you have the whole thing debacle with CBC and APTN.
Which is terrible.
Right? And all the things coming out, and it's just splitting the divide even further and further.
Yes.
Do you look at that then and go like, oh, this is orchestrated? Not the Francis Widdowson part. Because if it wasn't Francis Widdowson, it probably would have been somebody else.
Exactly.
And how they've attacked it from a liberal government standpoint to fracture the Conservative Party, their nemesis.
And they've been successful.
From a part of the voting bloc, which would be First Nations. Because you can't have things get united. You can't have things go smoothly. You look at it and go, no, they had to step in and throw an absolute hand grenade in there to blow up what they were building.
Well, look at it. Look at it from logically. Because I see big picture. Look at what Biden did and Obama did in the United States. Look at the strategy that was used to inflame tensions that never really were there on a large scale.
When you say Biden and Obama, tell me specifically what you mean.
Well, we look at the rise of Black Lives Matters. Look at how those organizations were co-opted out of other actual leftist movements that like Occupy.
They took George Floyd and made it a huge movement that crossed borders, I might add.
Yep.
And then everybody was like, basically, blacks are mistreated and inflamed racial division.
Exactly.
Over something that most people are like, what are you talking about? Actually, you know, it's funny because the amount of people I've ran into Manitoba, but this isn't just Manitoba. This goes to Saskatchewan, Alberta, and I bet it goes right across Canada.
Yep.
They'll say, listen, I'm not racist, but there's a ton of immigrants here.
Yes.
And the amount of Americans that are running into to start out with, I'm not racist, but... And that has happened because of things like George Floyd. It's happened because of the influx of immigrants coming in and causing problems.
Chaos. It's chaos,
yeah.
Right?
So that's political games playing out in front of the average person.
Yeah. So when I look at it, is that when I first started getting into talking to people in X and delving into political ideology and movements and those things. I'm fairly apolitical. I'm very conservative in some ways, but in other ways, I'm not. I mean, I have an Indigenous background, and that's just. And I'm a woman. I'm in construction. I mean, I have a pretty different slate of.
You're a fun guest. Yes.
So
you have a very interesting background, right? You can speak on a lot of different topics, but specifically when you're looking at the politics of Canada, you might be one of the first people to tell me, and I'm. Probably forgive me to all my guests, but in recent time you're taking limited hangout, which I believe is an American term.
Yeah.
I wanna go into some of the commentators in that realm, but regardless, I'm applying it to Canada and going, this feels like a limited hangout, and you're looking right at independence, and I go, that's interesting, because from where I sit in Alberta, I go, it just seemed like it was the most natural thing. The day before the election, I went, if Carney wins, which it feels like at the time, when we did our election live stream, I wrote up my prediction was a liberal minority. I couldn't believe I was writing it on paper.
Yeah.
I'm like, but all my research tells me that's where we're heading.
Yep.
And then we got the liberal minority.
Yep.
In my heart, I went, and 2 hours after that, 30 seconds after that, Alberta independence is going to go through the roof because people are done. They're done with all the things. Now,
rightfully so.
And now you sitting in Manitoba look at it and have a different you're like, it just feels like a limited hangout. So when you say a limited hangout, what are the things being said and done where you're like, people need to pay attention to this?
Okay, so one of the things that really struck me as odd, because like I said, Keith Wilson in particular, even Jeffrey Rath, because he's had a huge history of representing First Nations in different court cases and things like that. I looked at the legal minds that were talking about the viability of independence, and they were spot on. They really are spot on in the way they viewed it and things like that. Me coming from the background that I did, and I have such a fundamental core part of me believes in self-determination, is that as a person, as a Métis woman, as an Indigenous person, I have the right to self-determination. And in Manitoba, I'm fortunate because I am part of the MMF, and we have a self-government treaty We have a treaty with the government of Canada, and I know what it feels like to be encompassed within that, which is a totally amazing feeling. It's not perfect, but it is an amazing feeling.
Can we pause right there? Because I think, part of our discussion, I have to bring the audience back in on that, because we've been talking all day, right?
Yep.
And so when you talk about being a Métis woman, you got to give the history of when Métis, they weren't allowed to have their names, they were kicked up, right? Because like that's an important part. When you just say, yeah, well, I'm a Métis woman, like all these things, it's important to me. There's history that I think not only Albertans, but Canadians, that want self-determination, that want the government to leave them alone. It's like we should be learning from each other on some of the things we've gone through. And in your lineage, I think that's an important part of the story of when you say, I'm a Métis woman. Well, what do you mean by that? Because people need to understand.
Like in our family and my family, from my father's side and my mother's side of the family as well, but really from my father's side. My father's side is that the men in our family came with Lord Selkirk to the original Red River settlement as part of these Selkirk settlers, but also prior to that, as fur traders, as part of the Northwest and Hudson's Bay Company. So that many of the men in my family traveled down, and they came down from northern Manitoba. They came through York Landing, they came through Norway House, and they traveled Lake Winnipeg down to what is now the Lockport, Lower Fort Garry region, and the Winnipeg area, where they were establishing the trade networks. The fur trade is what was the gateway to Western Canada. Winnipeg, Selkirk, Lockport, Petersfield, all these communities where you're sitting in right now, this was the hub. This is where all of that trade and economic boom was happening. And when the men came, they took Indian wives. They created familial ties to multiple communities. So from that, and many of them were French, and some of them were Scottish, and some of them were Irish, and some of them were English. But what happened was that created an entire segment, a distinct group of people, a distinct group of Indigenous in Canada.
Well, the interview that's two before you, Mike Fast, was talking about a similar thing in South Africa with black, white, and colored, and how they were distinct things. Now, he was talking about it from a Christian standpoint in churches and how they had black churches, white churches, and colored churches.
Yes.
Now, they didn't interact. And he was talking about how they started to interact with each other and started to create ties to one another. So when you talk about the English, the French, all these different groups of men coming over and starting to take wives that were Indian and create familial ties, I can see how, and I just get that, I guess. And it ties into an interview I literally just did in Manitoba. So carry on.
So literally, my family, we were officially listed on the Register of Half-Breeds. That's how Manitoba rolled at that point in time before it was a province. We were that's how we were referred to. And so, but these men weren't just, they weren't just, employees of the Hudson's Bay or Northwest Territories. And they weren't just settlers. They were creating relationships. They were building bridges between multiple First Nations and multiple communities. And they were creating their own language, their own culture, this distinct segment of what Métis people are. And it's a rich history of what that is. But the Métis were the ones in Manitoba that led the first successful and the only successful rebellion in Canada. And that's where Manitoba came from. So here at Lower Fort Garry, when the first massacre occurred, when the Orangemen came from Ontario into Manitoba and across from Selkirk, and they murdered and they massacred women and children and the men that were on that side of the river, that led to the first rebellion here in Manitoba. And there was a lot of things that led up to it. What was happening was that the railroad was starting to come through. The Métis were given scrip, which means is that they were given blocks of land, about 160 acres per individual that was listed as Métis. We were on the register of half-breeds. And I showed you that Century Farm, 1882. That is where that came from. So that was scrip land, and it's still being farmed by my family today, 1882 to today. So when we look at those things, is that so as the rail line was coming through, they were buying up Métis scrip all the way along. But sometimes they weren't buying the Métis scrip. Sometimes they were taking the Métis scrip forcefully, burning out the families, taking the scrip. And moving along west to build out that railroad. And that's Sir John A. That's part of the legacy of Sir John A. that doesn't get talked about. So the Métis were disenfranchised in Manitoba, and they were disenfranchised in Saskatchewan, and they were led by Louis Riel. And you had people both on the inside of the forts and a part of the Hudson's Bay Company that were sympathetic to the Métis cause and the Métis idea of being disenfranchised. And that led to the first rebellion with Louis Riel. And Louis Riel became our first premier. And the successful resolution of that rebellion was the creation of Manitoba. We became a province. And we became a part of Canada.
With Louis Riel, I assume he united the people of Manitoba. I mean, before it was Manitoba. But like the people that were upset with being burned out of their lands and forcefully taken. And then I assume when you're talking about the Orange men coming, that they were upset that they weren't getting out of the way of the railway.
Yep.
And they were like, well, everybody dies then. And they just walked in. And I assume that created, you go to like something like COVID. There became a distinct group of people
yes.
that were upset with their government. And it ended or became very notorious, famous, take your pick.
The convoy.
Yeah. And that was the people that showed up and went, this is over. And the leader of that, whether you take different people that you think led it, they became Tamara Leach and Chris Barber. And
lightning rods.
They became the lightning rods of
yes.
it. Louis Riel back then
was a lightning rod.
Was a lightning rod that became the voice of that group of people of like, this cannot stand. And I assume he united that group of people to stand against it.
He united a core group, but there were people on both sides of it because not everybody is going to do that. Some people were scared, and some people chose not to, or some people had reasons not to take part in the rebellion, and some people that he was an absolute lightning rod for him because Louis Riel actually left when he wasn't able to take his seat in Parliament. He actually ended up leaving. He went to
the States.
He went to Montana and started a life there. And then there's been things it was said about him, like going into madness and things like that, or delusions. But he was convinced to come back to lead the second rebellion in Saskatchewan, because as the problems that were in Manitoba moved into Saskatchewan, which would have still been Rupert's land at that point in time, because they were not established, and the rest of the treaties were being signed. The original 10 treaties were still being expanded outward to Alberta during that time frame. So he was a lightning rod for the second rebellion, in which he was caught and he was hung. But he wasn't just hung; he was dismembered.
Dismembered. Yep.
He was dismembered, and his body was scattered, and there's stories about how locks of his hair and other things were taken as trophies by RCMP and things like that. So that type of history, whether it would happen 100 years ago, 200 years ago, but that as a particular people, that brutality exists when it comes from a government, right? What a government is capable. It's just like this long, it's almost like a genetic memory that you have of that. So you're taught through the generations what your history is. And so that becomes an internal core of who you are. And so those that embraced who they are, you have that fire 200 years later.
What was the defining point of the first rebellion in order to get Manitoba recognized? What ended up what events took place in order for that to become a thing?
So what happened was that when they took the fort, it was a negotiated release. So they did hang one of the Orangemen. And when I talk about Orangemen, I talk about that's a form of organized militia at that point in time that would have been organized underneath the Canadian government. So they would have been sometimes they were regular men, sometimes they had training prior, but they formed a militia, a lot like you see in the United States, those types of militias. And so the Orangemen, as they were referred to, when they came across, and they did kill as many as they did, and the fort was taken over. Now the fort was the center of economic activity to the west. They had to negotiate with Manitoba because, again, we were the gateway to the west. Unless they settled the Manitoba question and the Louis Riel uprising, they weren't going to be able to expand west.
Yeah, they weren't going to be able to take the railway west.
Yeah, so, and because the Canadian government,
you might call that a pressure point. And I feel like Tooze is saying Danielle Smith has the same opportunity with Ottawa right now.
Yeah, and I feel bad for her because she's in a tough spot. She's in a tough spot. She has a lot to try and manage that's underneath her plate with that. And it's, I don't know if the Indigenous question is helping her position or if it's hurting her position. I haven't been able to figure that out yet. But what I see.
Yeah. So once again, the reason I wanted you to talk a bit about the history is because, like, it just, when you say I'm Métis, it's like, well, there's a ton of history there that's very important to the West.
So we chose this. We chose this. So Canada has a history. We already have a history of whether or not we could have separated and created our own, but Louis Riel chose to create Manitoba.
Well, I wonder. I'd be very curious to have been in the boardrooms back then when they decided to join Confederation, and whether Louis could sit here right now and look at what Canada's become. It's changed, right? Like, there's been a ton of change, probably since his time, obviously since his time, but then in the last 11 going on 12 years of liberal government, and people will argue longer than that.
Yeah.
Canada is becoming a strange place. And yet, I mean, I just came from Kleefeld, Manitoba, where it was lovely. It was insanely enjoyable.
Yep.
And there are parts all over Canada that are just like that. But then you go to Winnipeg Beach, and it's immigrants everywhere. You go to Sylvan Lake, and one of the most popular beaches in Alberta. It's immigrants everywhere. And am I against immigrants? Obviously not. But when it's so stark, you can just see it with your own eyes. People are starting to question the direction the government's been heading. And a lot have been questioning for a long time.
Yeah. And the biggest question that for the people are having is when you're looking at that massive influx of immigration, is that Indigenous are looking at this and they're saying, do we have a reason to be concerned in terms of the displacement of some of the historical issues that still need to be resolved in Canada
that you've been fighting for a very long time?
And First Nations, the groups that I've worked with, just brilliant constitutional minds, and I look at these things and I look at it and I'm like, their issues, the very valid issues, have been pushed down, and a lot of that has been part of what the reason why that's happening, I think, is it's happening alongside of this discontent of the economical pressures that this mass influx of immigration has had. So as people have no jobs, they're displaced from jobs, they have no housing. They have no affordable housing. Their children can't get a job. Cost of living is going way up. Access to healthcare has become a huge problem. That puts a massive stress on any population. But when you add that stress to the Indigenous population, it's even greater, because now they're seeing is historical grievances that were on the road to resolution now took a second, like a back seat almost to some of these other things. And I think our government has very, very strategically taken those issues And they've been able to turn the tables to be able to do that.
It's interesting because I think what a lot of people see is a lot of money being earmarked for Indigenous.
Yes.
And so they see that as, what are we talking about? There's so much money going. It's become billions of dollars being sent to First Nations.
Yes.
What are you talking about, Jocelyn? This is a win for you. Like, what are we talking about at this point where you're talking about, well, actually, no, maybe, I don't know.
This is actually, I'm glad you brought this up because this is perfect. I actually had this conversation on X just a couple days ago.
Do you want me to let your dog in?
Pardon me?
Do you want me to let your dog in?
She's crying to come in.
I can let her in if you want.
You can let her in.
Keep talking. Keep talking.
So we had the we had this this
come on
issue,
in, Pop.
and somebody had asked me a little while ago, and they said is that 30 to $50 billion is going to First Nations and Indigenous across Canada on a yearly basis. And I said, okay. I said, but I'm gonna reframe that. $30 to $50 billion per year gets earmarked for First Nations and Indigenous. So you're talking about Métis groups and Inuit and everything else. So that's all of Canada, $30 to $50 billion.
Okay.
That covers healthcare. That covers education, the schools. It covers infrastructure, water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, operational budgets, and everything else in between. How much money was allocated to municipalities and cities and local governments across Canada on a yearly basis? $128 billion for operational funds only. And then if you look at school taxes and education, and what was the educational bill for education across Canada, you're looking at another $130 billion. And then you have to go and look at what was the healthcare budget, not including Indigenous, was another $400 billion. So people look at the earmark to Indigenous because it comes from one funding source. Federal government versus a treaty formula that goes to the First Nations, and that goes out to other self-governing agreements and things like that. That gets the flows on that. But municipalities, they get their money from property taxes, federal government, provincial government, and you see how that money flows. Now, where does the provincial government get its money from? Local taxation, sales tax, other types of levies and fees that they do taxation throughout, and then federal government transfer payments. So when people talk about the Indigenous do this and the Indigenous do that and that, almost the same value per person in Canada is very similar. It's going to per person to Indigenous, per person per average Canadian. The funding streams are different. It's the one group in Canada that totally gets fucked over? Rural Canadians versus any other group in Canada. Why? Because they have to build. They have no infrastructure to connect to. They pay exorbitant property taxes. They pay sales tax. They pay income tax. They pay every other tax. And they get very little benefit that comes back out of it. So they actually fund a huge amount of taxation in Canada, and businesses do the rest of the taxation. And then people talk to me and they said, what's one I just got? Oh, well, what about Indigenous? They don't pay any taxes. They get all this money for free. Well, actually, that's not true. The majority of Indigenous in Canada on reserve and off reserve pay property taxes. So if you have a house off reserve, you're paying property taxes. You are paying sales tax. You are paying income taxes. You're paying every other tax exactly the same way. If you live on reserve and 90% of your income is from wages that are earned on reserve only, You have, under the Indian Act, I think it's Section 87 of the Income Tax Act, you are exempt from paying GST, PST on purchases, and your income tax is not, you're considered exempt. That is a very small percentage, very, very small percentage. So the vast majority of Indigenous in Canada are paying exactly the same taxes that you or anybody else pays. But then we get the comment back is that, oh, you're Indigenous. You don't pay for anything. You don't pay taxes. We're like, oh my God. we may have access to a few programs where maybe we can get, access a little bit easier entry into university or to colleges, or we might get part of our education supported in that, which is based on grade point average, by the way. That's merit based. Imagine that. So this is the other side of the house is that I went through an Indigenous program to go to university for engineering. I paid my tuition. Nobody paid my tuition for me. I paid for my books and everything else. And same thing with my son.
Jocelyn, it's like, well, this is why people like listening to you talk, right? And why I talked to a First Nation man, this is a long time ago. I said, like, how do we fix the relationship? And he said, oh, you got to come out. You have to start talking to people, right? That helps running into you, because I like a woman who speaks. I like people, but a woman who speaks her mind, because I'm like, this is just easy to read.
Yeah. So going back to how does this fit into separation and separatism? Why do we say it's a limited hangout? And why are Indigenous people, grassroots Indigenous people that are on the ground, and just like me, just like anybody else of my friends, we're looking at this and we're looking at it and we're like, all we're hearing coming from, and it may not be, it's insidious. Like, let's
wait, but actually, I want to hear. What are you hearing first? Okay. That's what I wanted to hear, because I'm like,
the limited hangout. Because what happened is that for Indigenous people, and you can go on to X or Facebook or even around family dinner tables, because I've actually had it happen.
Sure.
And people come back to me and say, "Oh, you know what? I was reading this and this and this, and the Indigenous got this much money, and they're sucking the tit of the Canadian taxpayer, and they're doing this." And then I saw something inserted into that. And at first it was about money and economics. But then I saw something that was inserted in BC and Alberta. It was an attack on the actual cultural beliefs of Indigenous people. So now, for the first time in my whole life growing up, I was never referred to as a savage before. I was never referred to as barbaric. I was never referred to as uncultured. I was never once told that, it is that we had, we didn't know science or math.
Well, this is interesting, because on your end, you're seeing language. And for that, it's savage.
Yeah.
And what was the other one you said?
Savage, uncultured, barbaric.
Okay. And on my end, one of the things I applauded Danielle Smith when I interviewed her is we got called traitors, people that were even thinking about separation, independence, as traitors. And we saw it from lots of not only media, but leaders.
Yes.
And then she was like, I'm not going to call these people traitors. That is, we're talking about like a chunk of my, like 30% of my population that I represent. I'm not going to do that. That's a ridiculous thing. And, I was saying to you when we were chatting back and forth before I got here through text, I was like, I don't even notice that. But now that you mentioned savage, it's funny. As an everyday average person that I think I am, I saw a couple of those. I'm like, that's ridiculous. And I just kept like going through, I don't spend any time. But just like some other people would say, yeah, the traitor thing, that was ridiculous. And I just kind of scroll it. But let's hold there for a second.
It's
the traitor,
and
it came from prominent people.
Yes.
For me, when a premier says they're traitors, I'm like, that isn't Bob from down the street saying it. So in this limited hangout, you're saying you're watching influencers start to position it. And the reason, I don't know if this is the reason. I can't speak for anybody because I've never had this conversation, obviously, and certainly not on the language of it. But one of the things that happened with the independence movement is they collected all the signatures.
Yep.
And then a group of First Nations chiefs said, listen, we weren't consulted. And it got it held up in court.
Yep.
And what everybody got frustrated with is like, wait a second. You're going to pick on that one, but not the Forever Canada petition? That doesn't make sense because nobody consulted you there either.
Yes.
And so that was a sticking point, a dividing point of the hypocrisy of like, well, if you're going to call out one, then call out both. But you can't just call out one.
Yes, that's cognitive dissonance. And this is what frustrates me so much is that we see the same situation, the same dynamics maybe presented between two different groups of people. And I look at whether we're looking at the United States Blacks, we're looking at Indigenous in Canada, I'm looking at immigrant populations, I'm looking at established Canadian families, established Canadian businesses. I see everything through the lens of, is this cognitive dissonance? Is this the same situation? Why don't the same rules apply? And I'm kind of like a purist that way in terms of being like, for me, that is a source of ethics, is that every situation should have, if it's the same situation, the reaction should be the same or similar, right? And I was seeing that was being changed, and it was being massaged, and things were being promoted. So what I saw from influencers, especially conservative influencers on the independent side, is that they were putting out tweets or posts on X and in other groups that, even though they may not have directly, well, some of them do it directly too, the comments that were produced as a result, how do I put this? They were seeding comments. This is a perfect analogy. They would put out a post, and a post could be taken one way or the other way. Is this inflammatory? Is this not inflammatory? Am I walking the line of inflammatory? And the comment would drive pro-independence sentiments, but at the same time, what it was doing is it was seeding the comments that were referring to Indigenous as savages, that were
as subhuman,
and you could see that. And Francis Widdowson, that particular one, that if there was one situation that absolutely, completely shocked Indigenous people as to the volume of the rhetoric, I think that was it. Like, because it was, you see comments that came out of that were inflammatory, and they were not attacking the valid concerns, is that with Aboriginal title and UNDRIP and how those are being changed in Canadian law, and what are the long-term impacts for Canadian property owners. And property ownership should be solid. That is, and courts have said that throughout. Like, you see court decisions that happen on the other side when it comes to Aboriginal title versus that. The courts have said is that we need to handle this delicately, because people that have established property, we need to be able to, it's not going to promote reconciliation if we start seizing people's property and that. So it's a very delicate conversation that has to be had. And there's other ways to address historical issues. And the courts have said this flat out. They have been very careful as to how they've said it. Especially the Eastern Canada decisions have been phenomenal in their perspective.
On the West Coast, right, we're seeing a very different thing go on there.
Because the laws were changed. BC is different. BC ratified UNDRIP, and they integrated it into Canadian law in the province of Manitoba. So, and all of BC is unceded.
In your conversations with your group of friends, when you watch what's happening in BC, are they like, well, that's awesome? Or is that like, what are they doing? Like with UNDRIP and all that, specifically to that, to going back, the 7 generations to find, we fished in this village and that gives us property rights over whoever has it right now. Like, in your conversations with your group of friends, is it, like, I know my conversation, I'm like, if this carries on, I'm like, where does this get Canada to? In your group here, what are your thoughts?
So there's two issues here. So the first issue is that a lot of, we'll back up 1 second. The provincial government of BC for decades has kicked that fucking can down the road. They had the ability to be able to negotiate with every single one of those First Nations in British Columbia and create modern treaties.
Because to fill in a blank on my, at least on my brain, is one of the things that separates BC from, say, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, is they, minus in a couple places, don't have signed treaties with all the tribes.
No, yeah, they don't have modern treaties. So when JWR, before she was elected to government, she was actively working on the land claim issues in BC. She was working with First Nations in BC and kind of working towards a solution towards that unceded question because of what it did to property titles and things like that. That was always been a real issue, and that was on her radar right well before 2015. Well, and she had some solid solutions, and the files that she worked were actually bringing progress closer to that end. So then the BC question would have been answered, settled, and it would have been integrated into Canadian law. For the original 10 treaties across Northwestern Ontario, Manitoba being where the first treaties were, Saskatchewan and Alberta, we have the original 10 treaties. Those treaties were signed. Those treaties aren't perfect, but they are a part of the Canadian constitutional basis. Those treaties are rock solid, and every single court decision goes back and references those treaties on a constitutional and charter basis. So when we talk about treaty rights, why treaty rights are important is that it gives the Indigenous an opportunity to argue a case on the merits of charter and constitution. Those treaties are recognized under the Canadian government, Canadian law. It's a part of the fabric of Canada. It is what it is. Treaties are not the Indian Act. People have to remember those are two different issues. So when we look at BC, a lot of us looked at it, what was happening in BC, and we're like, that is a god-awful storm that is coming. And that is going to destabilize BC. It is going to destabilize the economy in BC. There is so much investment in BC. Is that going to chase investment out of Canada? We were looking at what was coming in terms of all the NGOs that were really supporting the Indigenous within BC. And what we saw was there was a lot of interplay. So when people look at the dynamics between the various First Nations in BC, you have to understand is that some have negotiated really well. Some have had fantastic negotiators and have been able to create good agreements. Some haven't. And some get a lot of funding from outside groups, whether that's American interests or foreign interests across the board. And some of the First Nations have probably strategically said, if the Canadian government and the BC government is going to keep kicking this issue down the road, and they're never going to settle, and they're never going to bring in a modern treaty system, what are our options? Burn it all down? And if you're in Western Canada and you're looking at this, you're going, well, I'm never going to buy anything in BC.
I don't know of anyone who's going to buy any property in BC anytime soon.
I look at that and
Isn't it wild? Even with all your background, I'm sitting here and I go, this is so cool. Like you're literally looking at it the same way I looked at it.
And because that's the actual fact of it. Now, so I've given you the history leading up to it, is that the reason why it got to this point is because the federal government and the BC government, but they not even wouldn't settle. They wanted the status quo. They thought that the status quo was going to be peaches and cream forever. They thought that they could continue to pay the royalties out on the mining and all the other projects that were there, and this was going to be perfect. But
can I ask?
It's sickening.
Curious, your thought. Man, I'm enjoying this. I hope everybody else is enjoying it. Like when you look at Canada, sitting where I sit in Alberta, like everybody knows it started in COVID. I was like, what is going on? So
Yeah.
and we went to the Freedom Convoy, and you came back and you watched, and a ton of people said Pierre's not the answer. And I, at the time, roughly had thought, yeah, they could be true, but I mean, anything is better than what we currently have.
True.
And it could put us on just a slightly different trajectory.
Yep.
Maybe not. I had lots of people around me saying, we need another Liberal government because people need to understand how quickly we're going down the toilet if we're ever going to fix this. Well, we got our Liberal government. We got Carney.
I don't think we're fixing it.
And you don't think there's any fixing it?
Not anymore. I think if Pierre would have got in, Pierre might have been able to stem something before it got too far. Point of no return.
Okay. So then, Jocelyn, Métis woman, construction superstar of Manitoba, fighting the federal government every step of the way. You look at this and you go, you're sitting in Manitoba. You're like, there's no fixing it. Okay. So then, are you for what Alberta's doing, or are you against what Alberta's doing? Because where I sat is like, as soon as I used to think of myself as Canada first, full stop. I actually agree with the interview right before you where she's like, the idea of Canada is a majestic idea. It's a beautiful idea. And somewhere, maybe from the very beginning or somewhere along that, our history, power, politics, human beings, whatever, corruption, take your pick of words, just started to play itself out. It has been, if you go back and read some of the accounts from First Nations, they were probably the first to be absolutely harassed by big government.
Yep.
And what they wanted, and they burned down everything to get, you've already shared some of that. But you get to where you're like, there's no fixing it. Okay, so are you for what Alberta's trying to do? Because from their standpoint, this may be the way to save Canada. This may be the way to shake it up or cut some of the ties and force things to happen. Do you think it's possible that it's a good thing? Or I don't know, your thoughts.
My first thought is, what am I for? 100% I'm for self-determination. So if the people of Alberta vote, and they vote in that referendum that the majority of Albertans want to choose another path, that belongs to them. That absolutely belongs to them. It would be wonderful if, and because remember, I served in the military for 22 years. So for 22 years.
I kind of forgot about that. That's going back to our first conversation.
Yeah, like there's me in uniform over there. I'm uniform on the wall. Like, I mean, and I've got, a CD and everything else, and I served.
It's where the spit and fire comes. You know what would be fun? Having you on a military roundtable. I remember telling you that once upon a time too.
Oh yeah.
When you come out to Saskatchewan, like Zane Southgate was just here, and he stopped at Jamie Sinclair's on his way back. We should do Jamie, I know you're listening. We should do a military roundtable and get Jocelyn in on that. Do it at the campground in the future, some point in time. But regardless, carry on.
I loved everything about being a Canadian woman in uniform. I loved my career. I loved everything about it, even when it was hard. I loved that career. I loved my queen. I loved my country. That was inside of me. But 220, 221, 222, that changed something in me. What I discovered is that maybe the Ottawa government doesn't love us. Maybe the idea of everything that we give, we have no love in return. And then I go back to my Métis roots, and when Louis Riel fought to bring Manitoba into Confederation because he wanted a better future for the people of Manitoba, all of those people of Manitoba. And it didn't matter whether they were First Nation, whether or not they were Métis, whether or not they were settlers. All he wanted was for a fresh start and a new dream for Manitoba. And so I kind of looked at that. But what I've seen is historically, the Western Canada gets a raw deal. And it doesn't, the raw deal could be mitigated by good government. So if you have good government in Ottawa and ethics prevail in Ottawa, then Canada works. I think we're at the point of people wanting to separate because government in Ottawa failed. The idea that we could work, we could prosper, we could have, a say in government. But when you were in Manitoba, and I know that I'm not even going to be done voting yet, and the decision is already going to be made, you know how demoralizing that is? And you fight so hard. Like in the last election, I was a scrutineer. In fact, my husband was a scrutineer. My foreman was a scrutineer. My son was a scrutineer, and we all took part in that. Like we all took part in the process, like we always do, because we wanted to be a part of that. We wanted to see the change. I have done loads of the rallies with Pierre Poilievre, and I've spoken to him, and I've had some, and my other members of parliament, and I try to engage in local government. I try to engage in provincial government and federal government. I want to believe that the system can work. I want to believe that. And I try very hard, and I pour everything into trying to believe that it can work. But then you realize is that it only works if the party that is in power is ethical, and they're going to play by the rules. So the norms of Parliament, are they going to follow those rules? Are they going to game the system? Are they continue going to squander taxpayer dollars? And it gets hard for me to be able to understand that. Like when I have friends and family and neighbors that are going to food banks every day, like every week, and they don't have jobs and they can't pay for things and they're losing homes. Having that faith in Ottawa becomes very difficult. So then when you look at the idea of Western separation, you look at that and you say, okay, is this potentially maybe a shot at what L'Oreal was talking about? Is this the 200 years later? Is this the new deal? Is this the new dream? For some people, it could be, absolutely, and they're hanging on to hope that maybe that's the new dream. So, I look at it is that I want people to choose their future and if they were to vote for independence in Alberta, I would absolutely respect that choice because those people made that choice. It's what they want. No different than any other place in the world. And then they would have to go through the same thing. You do your consultation with First Nations and Indigenous groups and find a way to be able to coexist in maybe a better way. And there's processes that describe how that has to work, and the process is already laid out there. So consultation and those things will have to happen. And then Alberta will have to choose. But I mean, is it time that somebody rattles that on a really, in a real way? Because in how many years since Canada's existed, how many times in history has it actually ever come close to Canada separating? You can say that Quebec was that in one way.
95, yeah.
And that was a bit of a constitutional crisis, but that constitutional crisis wasn't felt in the West the same way that this is. I think Alberta is what's probably saying to Ottawa right now, holy shit, they're serious. And how are we going to deal with this? Well, how the federal government decide they're going to deal with it, I think, is as relations are inflamed with those Alberta chiefs and BC chiefs and Indigenous, and as racial tensions are weaponized, and as propaganda prevails, and as social media is used to insert some really nasty comments and propaganda is seeded, I think the federal government will come back and they will use the Aboriginal question and the Aboriginal issues as a way to destabilize the independence movement. And I think that's what's happening. BC is a totally different issue. I think BC might actually have the potential to separate before Alberta. And that's that, because you look at that. I think BC's going
I think they're going to destabilize Alberta with what's going on. But who's going to be first? Not Quebec, BC. Northern BC is going, hell yeah, Jocelyn. That's right.
But if you were to talk to those people, you talk to the residents and that, BC residents, like the average,
100%.
They're like,
well, you think you just go to like, I've been getting asked a lot by people who don't listen to the podcast on the road trip. Well, what's your podcast about? I'm like, politics. And I can just see them doing mental math. And they're like, and where do you stand? And I'm like, well, stand on what? What do you stand on? Like, I bet there's a lot we agree on.
Yeah. And
BC, I think for a lot of people, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, if where you live you no longer own,
you're going to explode.
I think you're going to explode.
Yep.
And so I don't think you're off on that thought process. Sticking on Alberta though, because as much as I want to talk BC independence, I chuckle. I mean, October 19th they got a referendum. We got a referendum coming. The destabilization of a movement, we've seen it through COVID.
Yep.
They tried very hard to paint the Freedom Convoy as a bunch of different things and trying the propaganda, the labeling,
lawfare.
The lawfare, all these different things. We're watching it right now in real time with
Jeffrey Rath.
With Jeffrey Rath,
yeah.
But even the court proceedings on the counting of the votes, right? Now they're going to count it, they already have, sorry, and that's come out, but we're not going to use it for anything, because now there's it's just, to the everyday average person, you have to stop, take the emotion out of it. This is me. Put it aside, look at your emotion, go, why am I upset about this? If I would have gone back a couple of years, not even, when this first started, Mitch Sylvester started this is what we're going to do and the time frame and everything else, my logical brain said, if they ever get to where they currently sit right now, albeit the referendum's a little different than what they wanted, like the attacks are going to be insane and they're only going to get worse every step of the way. So we shouldn't get so emotional when they try and use First Nations, the judicial system, other means to attack it. It's like, yeah, folks, that's what's going to happen.
You know who raised exactly what we're talking about today? In a podcast you had with Alex Craner. Was that 6 months ago? Maybe about...
Let's say 6 months ago. Sure.
So it was the last podcast that I heard with you and Alex Craner. So if that was 6 months ago...
Well, no, that'd probably be less than that, because I think he was on right before we left for the trip, or roughly, probably 3 months ago.
So, and you guys were talking about the referendum, and you were talking about what was going to come up. And you guys are talking about how is the federal government going to respond. And Alex straight out the gate, he said, and I don't know if you remember that, he said, expect violence.
Yeah.
He said, expect things to get exponentially worse. And, that listening to that, Alex talk about it, he's not Canadian. He's European.
You're originally from Croatia.
Yeah.
And now he lives in Monaco. And he comes on the podcast, usually with Tom Luongo, albeit the one that me and Tom just did, he couldn't be on. And that sucks because it's always fun to have those two together, regardless.
So he's got a great perspective. Like, he has got such a wide perspective, and he is so knowledgeable. And he's got a different perspective than a lot of people. Like, he is, I love Alex and his ability to be able to make you see another side of things. And like, oh, that's interesting. And so then when Alex said that, it just something twigged. And that's when I said, and I actually said it to a couple of my friends on X and that we talk to all the time. And doesn't this feel like a limited hangout? I said, and I was talking about the podcast, and I was talking about Alex, and I was talking about some of the things he said leading up to this, and that doesn't this feel like the level of attacks that are coming out? Don't they feel kind of scripted? Don't they feel like they're being guided, or they're being pushed, like they're kept within these guardrails, and that they're turning the idea of separation and referendum into a racial issue? Don't you feel like once again, the Indigenous issues are being co-opted so that they can serve federal government needs? That's what it feels like. And because I'd never heard some of the commentary that I'd heard before leading out to that, people that had stood side by side with me working on various, Indigenous issues and provincial issues and things like that, where they were so inflamed by the rhetoric, come back and say to me, you guys are all just takers anyways. And I'm like, whoa, where did that come from? Where did that idea of Indigenous being only takers come from? So so what I'm seeing is a breakdown of community within these like Indigenous, non-Indigenous groups and things like that. And so you see that, and I'm like, very smart people being pushed down that route. Now, had they stayed on just the idea of corruption, because you know me, I've been talking about corruption on procurement for Indigenous projects and the ineffectiveness of how it's procured and how these projects are run. I have posted the goods. I have posted receipts on it. I have been doing this for years, for a decade. I have been talking about corruption and the misallocation of funds and the improper use of federal dollars.
Yes. Sorry, I'll let you finish your thought, because I want to make sure I don't lose this thought.
No, so here I am saying is that, you know what, if they approach the idea of, when you're dealing with Indigenous groups and you're talking about, let's just track the dollars, and let's talk about accountability and things like that. And if they had done that, but focused on all the responsible parties, which would be the federal government, ISC, third-party consultants, and the local level. What right now is that how the message got turned around is that federal government, Treasury, ISC, third-party consultants, engineer, general contractor, First Nation. That's kind of like how they kind of get dealt with, because all of these levels are delivering down to First Nation. It may show is that the First Nation is being the owner of a project and they would be up here, but the reality of it is that they sit at the bottom. They're not. They're simply a flow through, and they don't control the vast majority of the dollars on those projects. And people asked for all the capital projects. So, and this is something that has come out. The Auditor General has said this. There's been a lot of investigations. All of that, let's go back to the $50 billion in Indigenous funding for capital projects. How much of the capital project dollars are bled off due to inefficiency from the government, the inefficient program delivery, and third-party consultants? It's about 30 to 35% of those dollars. So if the operational budget of, say, we're looking at $50 billion, the operational budget for all First Nations comes out to about $15 billion. The other $25 to $35 million or billion dollars, capital projects and other forms of delivery. So let's take $25 billion. 1/3 of that $25 billion allocation earmarked for First Nations Indigenous projects was bled off and didn't actually deliver any value to the project that was happening on the ground. That's where my focus has been for a decade or more, is that I wanted to tighten up the number and get that to a reasonable number and try to fix that problem. So when we started talking about all these new issues, everything that's coming up right now, and people are so upset with that, what happened is that almost every single major conservative influencer, what did they do? They focused on the chiefs being corrupt, councils being corrupt, to a T. How many do we look at, and how many of those conservative influencers, how many of them tied it back to the federal government? How many talked about the 30 to 35%?
So what do you make of that then? Because like I know a lot of the conservative influencers.
I know you do.
And so this is what I was. I was trying to hold on to this thought because I'm like,
how do you call them a limited hangout? How do you look at them and say,
well, no, it's how do you? So like I think about myself, okay? I go back on Alberta independence and First Nations. I'm gonna say the first time I broached the subject was a Bruce Party Jeff Rath interview.
Yeah.
And sorry, Jeff, at the time you called him a communist and everything, and if he was a paid plant and everything. And at the time, I just was like, I was just bringing to get in my thought process. I was like, this will be really interesting because I thought Jeff had the most sound thoughts on First Nations when he'd been on the podcast earlier talking about independence because I'd had Sylvester and Modry and obviously Rath. And those three, I think, were the big ones at the time. And then there's been so many others since then. And then Bruce Party had written the article on making everybody equal. So I don't know what. This will be an interest. Nobody instructed me to do that. And so then you go to like how do other influencers and people work, you know? Like could they be instructed? Oh, it's possible.
well,
Or it could be that the federal government has interesting ways they can push on things to make it
Yes.
topical.
yes.
And one would be, I don't know, we had no say in this and you didn't consult us. And all of a sudden, then what does everybody talk about? The fact that the signatures are getting held up because they
Yes.
didn't get consulted. And then everybody starts talking about the inequality of how, you know, just like I said, how could you possibly push that when you have the Forever Canada petition that had a whole bunch of different rules and now you look at third-party advertising and how Lukasdik
Yes.
doesn't have to register that. And everyone's
Yep.
like, what is going on?
It's all wrong.
So
So
sitting in the middle of all the conservative influencers around independence, I'm like, very strange because you could press on buttons that they wouldn't possibly even think they're being pushed that way.
and they are. And they absolutely are. So whether they are knowingly or unknowingly being used as a limited hangout, they are being used as a limited hangout. And they are derailing a solid independence movement in Alberta. And to me, it is
Really?
mind-blowing. So, well, I'll give you an example.
Well, and so I sit, and I probably most people don't know this, right? But like, I try my very, very best not to hang out on X or any of the social medias as much as I can because I've done enough research. I've actually been talking a lot about this in Manitoba, off air, I might add, is that like it's just not a healthy way to live,
no.
right? And so I try really hard. And I mean, obviously, I'm like taking my family across Canada on a trip where we get to sit and meet people such as yourself. And so I actually don't pay attention to a lot of what the influencer's saying.
Yeah.
I really react to big news stories, bringing people on that way. I mean, obviously, me and you've been chatting for a bit, and I'm like, this is interesting. I can't wait to get there and talk to Jocelyn about some of this.
Yeah.
And yet you look at it and go, because once again, you're a province removed, right? Like you're too over. So you're looking at us going like, what are they doing?
I'm also seeing the impacts on the ground in between like people in Manitoba because Manitobans talk about Alberta independence just as much as Albertans. Like we're watching.
Interesting.
You mean it's not just an Alberta issue? Is that independence? The idea of Alberta separation and independence. People across Canada are really looking at it, but people in Western Canada, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, it's a mainstream idea. The thought of it is no longer thinking that.
Yeah, could this be possible? And is it just us that are thinking about it? Whether or not you hate
the idea,
the fact that it's not an actual, it's a referendum to have a referendum. It doesn't matter. It's become mainstream now to talk about independence, which was unthinkable probably 3 months ago.
Exactly. It is really so. And COVID started to you started hearing more about the idea of separation during COVID and things like that. And it kind of struck me as, oh, interesting. I started really looking at that, and then I started looking at into the reasons why. So going back to Trudeau Senior. So his policy on the national energy, that didn't just hurt Alberta, that hurt Manitoba, hurt Saskatchewan, hurt Alberta. Alberta was ground zero, but the impacts, where do many Manitobans work? They work in Alberta. They work in Saskatchewan. So there is a lot of interprovincial travel, and there is a lot of families spread out, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. Trudeau Sr. was absolutely hated, despised in Manitoba just as
much as in Saskatchewan or
in
Alberta. Or in BC for that matter.
From that generation, like my husband is 66. My husband remembers that, and in the impact and the fallout and everything else that occurred as a result of that. There was real world consequences for that for Manitoba families. So that age bracket, they remember. And when they look at what happened with Trudeau Jr. and now with Carney, the memory of that is very much there. So when you talk to people that were directly impacted by that, they have a very strong emotions that are on that. And I didn't understand it. I was a little bit too young to understand what was going on because I'm only in my 50s. So I understood after that. So when I look at the again, going back to the influencers and that, how the issues are being gamed. They've been gamed from the moment that we go back to the residential schools, is that when they chose that issue to laser focus on, I think that a strategy existed in Ottawa. In fact, I think that strategy existed in 2015 when Trudeau brought JWR on as Attorney General and brought her into the party. If you read both of her books, you'll see that she came to that realization that she was used as a pawn in order to gain standing with Indigenous groups, and she was lied to in terms of the impact that she would be able to have on our judiciary, the impact that she could have on ISC and Indigenous issues. The amount, I can't even begin to describe how much we lost when we lost her, because just her feelings on the judiciary. Look at all the court cases we've had and some of the terrible things and cases not being heard, and how our judiciary has been stacked. She was adamant against stacking the judiciary by party. She wanted merit-based appointments only. She fought for merit-based appointments in the judiciary. Perfect. She fought for people to be able to have an easier time to be able to sue the government. So if you're going to sue the federal government, she said is that the government should not be able to use the whole of government to be able to attack a small person that needed redress for something that was truly a grievance, but they were being forced to be bankrupted or whatever else was going on. She was trying to institute laws and policy changes that would allow that to be easier. So she had put together a track where people, if you were suing the government, that the first avenue was conflict resolution and not court, so that you're not bankrupting the single person that's trying to fight government and do those different things. She had such a beautiful way of looking at things, and she had a plan for settling the land claim issues and bringing on a form of self-government that would integrate into the Canadian law. It wasn't perfect, and but it respected both treaties and it gave opportunity, right? So that was lost. So when she was getting ready to unveil her package as to what she thought she was delivering, that was taken away from her. And literally, like a day before that announcement, Trudeau went with Carolyn Bennett's version versus the JW version. And that's when we lost her. That's when we lost our ability to have somebody with that knowledge and that credibility that was there. It was a huge loss for Canada.
Yeah, and JWR, Jody Wilson-Raybould.
Jody Wilson-Raybould.
If for anyone trying to do mental math on who you're talking about, you know, if you think about like what you're talking about, like the strategy and how they're using things and laying things out and just dropping the boom. It's the Tom and Alex way of looking at Canada, if I may say so. And you sit and you think about that. The only time, so what they're banking on everybody being is reactive
and emotional.
Right. They're going to find ways to create a reactive society, which we naturally are.
Yes.
And the only time, I got to think about that, maybe not the only time, but certainly with a mass group of people where I thought we were I thought the organizers were very proactive, was the Freedom Convoy.
Yep.
They knew they were going to try and do that.
Yep.
And they were telling people every hour, if not every 30 minutes, listen, no violence. We don't do that. So when you assume a mob's coming in, because as smart as we think this group of people, whoever they are, trying to drop these little bombs, they're not that smart. They're playing the odds.
Well, yeah.
And they have a lot of power and a lot of influence in order to try and play out those odds.
And think about that. Like I've noticed it is that when people that I know have come from Ontario and then they come here to Manitoba, sometimes I say to myself, wow, are we talking about the same country? Are we talking about the same issues? Because their perspective is completely different. But then you have to look at it, look at Ontario and not Quebec. Quebec has got a different thing going on. I think Quebec is constitutionally brilliant.
I can't wait to get to Quebec. We're spending like a week and change, I think it is, in Quebec.
Oh, yeah.
Montreal and Quebec City. That should be interesting.
Yeah, because I love people are going to go crazy. I love the Quebec perspective because hands down, if there was a single province with a brass set of balls on them.
Yeah, they got a backbone.
That's
and they're using it. And they don't care what anybody else thinks.
Exactly.
They could care less what the media is going to say. And I wish our politicians, specifically in my neck of the woods, just act like that. Who cares what they think?
Exactly. And really that is it. I mean, they put the and I don't agree with a lot of the policy they have provincially.
Sure.
And you don't have to, but you have to respect the fact that their political leadership has an incredible backbone and they are constitutionally savvy. They know their stuff. And they fight on Canadian law and they fight on Quebec law. So they know how to work to rule. That's basically how, and you know what I'm talking about with that. They know how to do it. They absolutely know how to do it. And
so if you come back though to independence, right? We keep straying all over the place, right? And we keep coming back to how the movement's being co-opted.
Yeah.
It's the way to remove or get out of the way of that is to be proactive.
Yes.
And proactive is difficult because in one sense it's difficult because you don't know where the next issue is going to come up.
Yep.
But you have to gauge the emotion of it and what they're trying to steer you into.
Yeah. And that's why I keep looking at these posts that come out on X, especially, from these influencers. And I want to say to them, and I just want to shake them and say, hey, guys, you tell me and you say that you are a supporter of Alberta independence and the right of people's voice to be heard. Is this going to help independence or is it going to create inflamed emotions? So there's so many good accounts that I would normally, a lot of things they say I agree with and I like and I follow them but then I look at when they come to the Indigenous issue, not any other issue, but the Indigenous issue. I'm like, where did your brain go? How can you be so astute on this side and not see the cognitive dissonance that you are displaying in this particular situation? Go back to things and none of these.
But this is where Tom and Alex come in.
Yeah.
Because you go, we all display cognitive dissonance in different ways. And it has been seated there for a very long time.
Yes.
And First Nations in Canada, well, I think I'd be lying if we don't all have some bias towards it.
And the bias exists on the other side too, right?
But that's what I mean. Actually, like I sat with a First Nation guy. Shout out to Aaron if he ever listens to this. In Good Spirit Lake, we're sitting there, and he was making fun of white people, and he looked at me. He's like, "I might be the most racist Indian you're ever gonna meet," and that's exactly what he said. And I started laughing.
And people used to be able to joke around about that.
Yeah,
but,
well, it was a fun little conversation.
Yeah, and
I would be lying if I wasn't like, this is a bit awkward. But at the same time, that's because the awkwardness has been built into our society.
Exactly. And so just as from a lack of historical knowledge that your average regular Canadians have been done a huge disservice by not being given correct historical knowledge. And on the same side of things is that political parties on First Nations and in Indigenous communities have also been encouraged to promote one political ideology. And people look at me and they say, "Is that well? Why do they keep voting NDP, or why do they keep voting Liberal?" Or why? Okay, let's go back to the funding structure in Canada. Is that if somebody is in a place of power and they control the purse and they have the gold, and one of my bosses said this to me. He used to say is that we used to talk about Kerry's golden rule, and I said, "What's Kerry's golden rule?" And he says, "Whoever has the gold makes the rules." And I laughed and then I realized is that, oh man, this guy was really smart. So the federal government has the gold. They make the rules. They can very strategically, through department resources, capital officers, and all of the different groups, they can deploy the whole of government and create programs, create the appearance of things happening, create the appearance of change, and they can drive opinion within Indigenous communities just as much as any other group. But because they have been in the seat of power for as long as they have, and the Liberal government has been so effective, and the Liberal Party has been so effective at being able to paint one group as racist or bigots or whatever you want to call that, that has been such a winning strategy, even though it is so incorrect and so unethical as to how it was done. But again, is that if the federal government has got $50 billion to go out annually, okay, which First Nations can we put our thumb on with and dangle a water treatment plant or dangle a new school? What is that local group going to say?
But they do they do the same thing with municipalities.
You betcha they do.
Provinces.
You betcha.
Right? They dangle money in front of them, say, "Hey, if you don't march to our beat,
you're not going to get
you're going to lose some of this funding."
So and you're exactly right. It's the same mechanism of exerting the thumb. But in the case of Indigenous, that thumb on the scales, that is viewed exclusively and not in context with how they do it with municipalities and cities and other groups and other provinces. So how is that isolated? First Nation, fly in, needs a water treatment plant, needs to get off boil water. What are they going to do? What are they going to say? Do they swallow a bunch of frustration and anger and all of that and take the project and do what is needed to be done and vote that particular government back in? Or do they walk their own road, and do they fight in another way? First Nations have done both. So some First Nations have gone the other way.
I would say it's going to be very much on the group of people there, because what you're talking about is having limited options. And I would say a very good piece of advice Brian Burke gave me is if you give yourself good options, you'll create good choices. And what you're talking about is not good options. You have very poor options.
No options, absolutely. So you have to, when people look at chiefs and councils of First Nations, you have to view them like a municipal government, because they're a municipal government in the end, right? They operate the same way. They provide the same services. How many municipal councils, city councils do we have out there that people are happy with? How much do people talk about corruption in the city of Calgary, corruption in the city of Winnipeg, corruption at the local level? How many investigations happen because municipalities are running things that are unethical, and now they've got ethics violations and investigations that occur? Same thing. But when you come to Indigenous groups, it's like the same behavior that occurred in a municipality has just occurred on a First Nation. Nobody even knows about this one, but First Nation, oh my God, the sky is falling, everything is going on, and they're so corrupt, and that is not helpful. What is helpful is when you can sit down and you can say, okay, this is happening here, this is happening here, this is happening here. This is the mechanism. How do we interrupt the mechanism? How do we change that mechanism from being possible? How do we clean things up at that level? And we use our head instead of using that emotional side of things. Not reactive, not emotional, rational. And so what I have seen in terms of Indigenous issues is that the Canadian population has been just propagandized to the nines. Is that and what in Ontario and a lot of other provinces, what is their perspective that they're hearing? Because they get one message, past the Manitoba-Ontario border. Conservatives are bad. Western Canadians are all bigots, they're all racist, they're all this, they're all that. Well, that's not the case at all. These various groups of people, whether they're Indigenous, old-time settlers, like the first wave of immigrants, first wave, Russian, German, Ukrainian settlers, all of those groups of people across Canada, they had to work together, and they did. So how do we set aside the purposeful, narrated, seeded propaganda to inflame racial tensions? Let's change the messaging. For conservative influences that are saying is that, focusing on chiefs are dirty, chiefs are this, chiefs are that. Let's look higher. What is the group that has the power, the influence, and the resources to be able to stop independence or any movement in Canada? Federal government. Start there. You're not going to change things at the First Nation level in terms of governance or anything else until you change things up here. You can't drive change from the bottom up.
Until you change the incentives.
You have to change it from the top down. It only ever works from changing from the top down.
The top. You also said earlier on there's just no fixing it.
Because immigration in Canada has gone to a point where that has put a massive pressure point on Canadians. And I don't know how that can be fixed. Then you have the racial tensions that are erupting across Canada and the breakdown. Like COVID was bad enough in how it broke apart families and communities. Yep. Now we're adding another level to that. Now we are creating a fundamental divide between communities, between Indigenous Canadians and non-Indigenous Canadians. And that should never occur. Like if there was, and
I'm glad you're the one saying it, because I don't feel it particularly, but I'm also not living it, right? And so this comes back to when EB called us traitors.
Yes.
Right? He called Albertans traitors, and he
Yep.
was speaking specifically to separatists.
Yeah.
But I talked to all the separatists, and so you feel that. You're like, wow, we've hit
I know.
COVID levels again.
We have.
When you're labeling a group of people with hatred, you're like,
Yes. And it's
holy mac, how did we get back to here?
And
And what
it's-
you're talking about with the savages
yes.
and all that, you're like, we're back to COVID again. And how do
Yes.
we get there from a group of people that I respect? I
E-
think is what I'm hearing.
Exactly. So, and this is where I'm looking at it. I'm like, all these smart people and people that I think are fundamentally good people and good intentions are being led by their nose, by their nose along a trek they don't want to go onto. I want to see Albertans, Saskatchewan, whichever group it is in Canada. I want them to be able to pursue self-determination, whatever choice they make. But the idea of self-determination, that's a human right. And ultimately, I think is that what team am I on? I'm on Team Humanity. I'm on the side of
well,
the
we share that, don't we?
Yeah, I like people. I like the goodness of people. I like being able to explore that, and I like that type of things. If I have to beat the hell out of somebody, I'm perfectly capable of doing that. But I would prefer to take Team Humanity road first, and that's a really that's a tough call when you have to say that. So I want to see self-determination. I want to see people decide, and I want to see people make the best choice that they possibly can make.
I want them to allow them to decide.
And
Because this comes back to another Alex Craner thought.
Yes.
And that is, if you don't allow them to decide, that's right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It comes to where the lid's blown off at
Absolutely.
some point. And you think of, in your mind, you see the rhetoric growing with First Nations
Yep.
and white people.
Yep.
I see the rhetoric growing between immigrants and white people.
Oh, yeah. You haven't even talked to that. You want to see what's the tensions and maybe not talked about. What's happening between a certain segment of new Canadians that have arrived
Sure.
and Indigenous communities?
I've started to see those videos.
Well, you can see some big issues that are happening. I'll talk about one that's just came out a little while ago, and there was a lot of it. First Nations in Manitoba are restricting who has access to traditional hunting areas, and they're restricting access to areas where people would harvest traditional medicines, sweetgrass, and other things, wild rice, things like that. Traditional medicines, sages. That has never been done in Canadian history.
And who is doing that?
First Nations are restricting
access.
But do you know why they're restricting access? They're restricting access because there have been an influx of people coming onto First Nations, shooting up First Nations, discharging weapons.
In Manitoba.
In Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta, it's and BC.
Yes. But specifically Manitoba.
Manitoba, because you saw how remote communities are
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Manitoba.
So their response to that is like, well, we're going to restrict access, which is the first time in history.
And my stepfather and I, we actually witnessed it firsthand. We were going out and we were checking because we were getting ready to go and do our hunt because we hunt. We're Métis harvesters. We went out to do the hunt, and what we found, and other communities are seeing this as well, is that people are coming in for the trophy, and they are taking the head with the full antler and everything else, and they're leaving
The carcass,
the
body.
entire animal behind.
And those are immigrants doing that?
Yeah. Not all of them, but a lot, because they don't understand. They don't understand the relationship that urban hunters of every background have created and built over decades with First Nations and in non-First Nation land, but maybe traditional lands that aren't a part of the First Nation, but they're traditional areas where everybody goes to harvest and everybody goes to hunt. And we all had, like, we have internally something called the rules of the hunt. And the rules of the hunt are something that's passed down from generation to generation to generation. And provincially, you have laws that say, okay, you have to get private property permission. You're going to go hunt in areas. Is that on First Nations? You ask permission to go there, because what happens is on a conservation level and on a First Nation level and on a Métis level, we track our herds. We are looking at making sure is that when we're harvesting, we're making sure is that we harvest in a way that's sustainable so we have a crop to go back to the following year. And then so with traditional medicines and the animals, they're being hunted for sport, or the medicines are being dug up in such a way that it has damaged those areas. And then Manitoba had big floods this year. So huge parts of our province were flooded out. And now those areas that were harvested, you can't harvest them for traditional medicines. So now we have less that's actually available to those communities. So now First Nations are saying is that if you are going to harvest on First Nation land or traditional lands, you need to get permission from the chief and council, and you have to be accompanied by an elder who will make sure that you're harvesting sustainably. But new Canadians coming to Canada, do they know any of these rules? Do they understand that there is 200 years of relationship built and understanding built between non-Indigenous hunters and Indigenous communities and people that do wild harvesting of mushrooms, of sweetgrass, of blueberries, of all those different things? Do they realize that there is 200 years of history and community building and relationship building, and then now, for the first time in Canadian history, that is being challenged. And so what did the First Nation communities do? They felt that they were being overrun in terms of losing valuable harvest, and it's important. And so they said, yeah, we're restricting access. And so regular Canadian hunters, they look at this and they're saying, why are they blocking access? Why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? And they're understandably upset. They're like, we've always hunted here. Why can't I hunt here now? And they don't understand why they're being turned around, but they don't understand the damage that's been done to these communities. And then you've got the organized crime that comes with it, right? Because a lot of
You're seeing organized crime in Manitoba as well?
Oh, yeah.
From immigrants is basically what I'm pointing out.
Yeah.
Because
big time.
Me and Tuesday talked about this a lot, right? About the extortion cases and everything going on in BC. You got the all the stuff going on with the tow trucks, but other things in Ontario. Then you got the things going on in Quebec.
Yeah.
And then we had extortion cases in Calgary. And I'm like, holy crap. Like, this seems like it's everywhere. But Manitoba is one of the provinces we haven't talked about.
Manitoba's a trucking hub.
That's a duh moment.
Where does every single truck that crosses Canada pass through?
Winnipeg.
And
Dad used to talk about it when he drove long haul across Canada. Is Winnipeg. I don't mean specifically, just that it came up a lot. But why? Because it's right there. I was telling Mel on the way here, I'm like, if you ever want to shut down Canada, here's where I'd put a tank. Right there. It's this little spot just east of Winnipeg where you cross in Ontario, and I'm like, and
that's the only road.
You're done.
So you look at it is that Winnipeg is a hub, not only east and west, north and south.
Yeah.
And all those trucks flow through here. We have had so many cases in the news of human smuggling, trafficking of young women, young girls, the increased violence that's happening within our urban areas, how that's expanding out, what that's doing to housing, the impact to housing, and the level of disregard for Canadian laws. And that is huge. It's absolutely massive. So where is that what does that do with Indigenous communities? And not every Indigenous community, but a lot of communities, is that now when they're seeing that come into their communities, They are shutting down their communities. They're blocking their roads. They're restricting access. And now they are working with band police and RCMP and other groups to say, okay, we have to stop this. The Manitoba just had 3 months ago one of the biggest busts in Canadian history, or in Manitoba history, and a lot of those names were a part of it. And you saw guns that were coming out of the United States. You saw cash, you saw coke, you saw meth, you saw heroin, you saw all of that for the proceeds of crime. And so we are feeling the impact. We've always felt the impact. And we've seen the degradation of various areas in Winnipeg, from the increased meth use, meth, homelessness, violence, no-go zones in Winnipeg now.
No-go zones?
Yeah.
Like you're talking like everybody talks about it, like you just don't go there type
Like
thing?
you just don't go there. But, before, every city has like maybe a 1 or 2 block, and, where you're like, that's a no-go zone. Well, now you're saying is, this mile stretch, that's a no-go zone. That whole district, that's a no-go zone, because you are now concerned about where you're going, when you're going, and things like that. And the downtown is just, it blows my mind. But it's the level of violence and the type of violence, right? I mean, what did I never really see in Manitoba before? Machete violence? It wasn't really a thing. Yeah, well, now in Manitoba, machete violence is a thing. And it was just a couple of months ago, we heard one where a guy came in and he went into another home and he took a machete to those people in there and injured people within that home. And it was, I think, 2 blocks from a school. So when you look at that type of violence, so you're seeing the increase in racial tensions between the new Canadian and mostly the non-vetted Canadian, because
because there's lots of great just Canadians that are new.
Exactly.
Right.
So
this is where we all go. It's like, well, I'm not against immigrants.
It's a nuance, right?
Yes.
And now, going back to it, I was, as an employer, I used to be a part of the provincial nominee program, right? So I sponsored people to come to Canada and work for me. And help sponsor them for permanent residency here in Canada. Sponsored one from Mexico. I sponsored one from Russia. So great families. Both. And they're both. I mean, in terms of both families, we ended up bringing their entire family here. Their kids all went to school here. Like, incredible people. And some from varied backgrounds, right? So the guy that I sponsored from Mexico, he was a mechanical engineer and an electrical engineer.
But you're talking about merit, common sense,
merit-based,
people that can come in and do the work. And I would argue, if they're coming in to do the work, they're probably learning how the country operates and operating within the lines, right?
And those relationships that I built from the people that I sponsored and worked for me for a number of years, and then have moved on and found other places to work in Canada. I still know the families. I still keep in touch with them, and they are great people. But you know what they told me when they were coming is that. And they're coming at a time like 2014, 2015, 2016. They said to me, Jocelyn, we came to Canada legally. We paid our way to come to Canada.
Yeah.
We supported ourselves here while we're in Canada. We did all these things. We followed all the rules. We had English as a second language. We were proficient in English. We had our medical done. We had our background checks done. They went through so many hoops. For each guy, it took me a year to go through processes, the LMIAs. It was the LMO and then the LMI, which was very detailed. And I had to provide a transition plan where I would be transitioning to a Canadian workforce, right? So I utilize the provincial nominee program. I understand how it works, and I understood where the system was being gamed. We used it for construction, for skilled trades, for designations of where you needed it, where you needed to bring in that extra workforce. Why is Olive Garden and Tim Hortons and McDonald's and Walmart, why are they hiring temporary foreign workers, and why are they accessing the provincial nominee programs for this? And so the group, the communities that I was a part of, because I sponsored 2 immigrant families here to Canada, they're angry. They followed the rules. They came here legally. They worked very hard to get to Canada. One friend of ours, she's now a pharmacist in Vancouver. She worked so hard to get here. She's got a master's degree on top of everything else she's done. And she is South Korea, so she's Korean. Oh my God. Like, you look at the quality of people that came.
The thing you keep pointing out is, like, we can all see the problems.
Yes.
We just have to speak clearly and concisely on what the problem is and the fact they're not addressing it.
Yes. So what?
And when you wash it over everyone, that's where you get into problems. They want to simplify. Team A, Team B.
Exactly. And the Canadians.
And we need to understand that Team A and Team B are probably roughly the same person looking, or same group of people. Do we agree on everything? Certainly not. I mean, like, you can go in your own family and realize you don't agree on everything.
But you're Team Humanity.
Yeah, that's right. And Team Humanity is messy and raucous and all the things. But when it comes to, like, looking at Canada or Alberta independence or any of this, it's like, it's Tom's idea. We're not a monolith.
Yeah.
But there's certain core issues where we probably all relatively agree. And we're looking at it going like, and this is why we always have to justify it. I'm not against immigration. I'm against flooding a country with a whole bunch of people who don't share our values. And don't follow our laws.
Yep.
And then when they break the laws, we bend the judicial system to allow them to stay and to allow them to keep breaking the law, and on it goes. I think all of us are against that. It's like, what the heck are we talking about here?
That's Canadian values, right? I mean, that doesn't matter which community you're from. Are you in an Indigenous community? Are you a First Nation? Are you in an urban center? Are you in Calgary? Are you in Edmonton? We're all saying the same thing. What do we want? We all want prosperity. We want a job. We want land. We want our kids to be safe. We want our kids to go to school. Those 5 things, that probably is the basis of Canadian values across the entire country. That's what the majority of people want. And that's not what we're seeing right now. And that comes to the idea of, we talked about independence, and the idea is that what is the long-term future for Canada? And I honestly see is that unless the Alberta independence movement can clean up the messaging, or at least understand that their messaging is being funneled along a set of guardrails, so that some very good strategists, I think that some of them might even be Conservative Party strategists, if I think about it, are being pushed down a path, and there's guardrails on both sides that are being implemented by our federal government and by maybe our federal Conservative Party, and that the independence movement messaging is being taken down that route versus where they should be, somewhere over here. And their message would be more readily accepted by a majority of people if they looked at where their messaging was following. And it's crazy because the Conservative Party recognized this decades ago. They knew that the Liberal Party was using that in order to pull off votes, right? They knew where to put their focus on in order to manipulate demographics and demographic voting. We know this happens. This is what polling is all about, right?
Yes.
And so if you don't understand that you are being subjected to propaganda and that you are being forced along those 2 guardrails, then you're not going to get out of it, and you're going to go down to and maybe Alberta gains their separation in 10 years, and they're in upheaval and increased tensions and everything else and uncertainty for 10 years, or they could maybe get a referendum this year, a clean referendum with a clear majority and a clear path, and one that is respectful. Now, if I were in the independence movement, what path would I be operating for? I would look at those 2 guardrails that are being put in place by outside groups, and I would say, why am I allowing my my movement? Why am I allowing my family, my friends, and myself? Why am I allowing myself to be put into a little path? Why am I not allowed to make my own path and have my own thoughts and have my own, ideas about how this works? And that's what I see the danger is happening. And I think there is time to turn around the messaging. I think there's a really good opportunity to turn around that messaging, but they have to stop doing what they're doing, and they have to stop inflaming the issues, because the issues that are being brought out in various posts and things like that, the reactions that they're getting, and I read them all. Like I'll get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I'll read, and that just to understand. And I'm like, I can see where people are starting now to recognize that we're farming this division and this racial tension that is being farmed, and it needs to stop. So, and
well, the thing about this podcast, Joss, is you probably realize it, or maybe you don't realize it, how many Albertans are listening to this. And one of the promises I had to myself and to the audience when I left was every guest I was going to ask them about Alberta independence, because I'm very curious. And the funny thing is coming over here and I'm like, it's going to be my first question, because me and Jocelyn have a history and I don't need to have the origin story. I think a lot of people, if they haven't gone back and searched you out, if you're new to the podcast and haven't listened to your story with a whole bunch of stuff, but a whole bunch of things going on, across us getting to know each other, because you've been on the podcast. I'm not going to sit here and say it was every month, but a bit. That's right. We've grown a friendship through it.
3 times I think I've been on the podcast.
And so I'm like, I'm going to walk in and this, and I sit here and I go like, how long have we been going for? I'm like, this is, and I'm like, Albertans are listening, and Albertans are sharp tacks.
They are.
And there's a bunch of them sitting there going, you're probably right on some things. And I'd be curious where this thought process goes. So
I hope they
because
understand.
what I'm not hearing is I'm against Alberta independence. It's like, you got to be careful, because where you're steering into is where they want to steer you into. And what that does is foment division.
And the reason why I think that, and the reason why I kind of have a real problem with some of where it's going, is that I will be tagged on threads there where people are, where some of these posts have come off, and then somebody who knows me, they'll say, hey, you know what, you should really talk to Sundance Construction, because they might be able to explain this a little bit better. And then I'll get the notification, I'll look at it, and I'm like, okay, and I'll go in and I'll post it.
What an interesting perspective to have, right? Of other people tagging you, saying, hey, you should probably comment on this.
Yeah, and so they will, and they'll bring
because the way I get sucked into a lot of these is, you should probably talk to Sundance. She could probably enlighten your listeners. And I go, oh yeah, sounds interesting.
So
right?
I get tagged like that. And so what I do is I have personally reached out to some of these influencers, personally said, hey, I would love to sit down and talk to you. I would love to be able to share with you my perspective. And I have physically sent some of the information and the assessments and things that I've done, like where things sit, and photographs and different things of different places, saying, this is something that I've worked on, or this is the situation I've run into. So I have shared physical, physical pieces of the story, right? And the response that I get back is dead silence. Oh, okay, and dead silence. So then I'm like, okay, I have just shared some very pointed information where I'm saying is that I would love to sit down with you and have a conversation, maybe on a national platform, and say, or a regional platform, and say, hey, maybe we can have a more nuanced conversation, and I can show you from where I've been involved in federal procurement and all these things, where the good is, where the bad is, and where the really ugly is. And we probably think the same thing about Brookfield. So, doesn't it seem odd that conservative influencers like that don't want to talk to me.
I don't know. I actually don't know who you're talking about because I've always really enjoyed our conversations.
Well, you're different in terms of that. You have such a huge variety of guests. Like your guests span like a huge gamut.
Well, because I agree with Tom's thought. Once again, I'm going back to a podcast from about a week ago where he's like, no country is a monolith. And I just take that and I go, well, no area is a monolith. No province is a monolith. No municipality is a monolith. There's just always, every time I think I start getting closer to the answer, then I talk to somebody, I'm like, oh man, I got so much to learn, right?
Oh.
So there's no point in there's certain things I'm very set in my ways. I mean, obviously you met my family earlier today, and I think very strongly about being a father and being married to the same woman, and there's some things that way where I've definitely set my my course, and I'm not going to be pulled off that. But then when you come to like politics, different arguments going on in different spaces, I'm like, I don't know, because you can talk to a lot of people and you got to build a picture. You know, I talk about putting in the puzzle pieces.
Yeah.
And like, you know, I got asked by Tim Bartel, the bee farmer, my thoughts on independence. And I'm like, and he's like, oh, I shouldn't ask. And I'm like, well, no, it's not that. No, I'm gladly talk about it. It's that I feel very young in like, should we have independence? Well, I know that I'm going to vote, and I know that I'm going to vote for, yes, we should have a referendum on independence, like an actual referendum.
Yeah.
And I have two thoughts in my brain that when it comes to that, Jocelyn, all my research shows, and I think we agree on this, I don't know if there's any saving Canada.
Yeah.
I think we're at a very dark place in our history where it's like, I don't know how to get out of this. I don't want to leave it. So in order to do that, I have to fight for it. And so then I would say, yeah, for one, you should vote for that reason. Two is like if you think of staying in Canada, Alberta should not leave Canada. Well, this vote actually doesn't make you leave Canada.
Yeah.
And Daniel Smith would say, well, be careful you don't mention the divorce word and everything else. I'm like, screw that. The only thing governments understand is force. And we saw that with the Freedom Convoy.
Yes.
When they showed up and wouldn't leave and did it peacefully, and no matter how much propaganda and how many times they called them this and that, and the public was behind them, what happened? All the mandates came off. Life returned.
Yes.
And I go, so why wouldn't 99% of Albertans who are frustrated, whether you're in Edmonton, Calgary, Lloydminster, to Vermilion, to Fort Mac, to Grand Prairie, to somewhere down in Lethbridge, and all across the rest of the province, go in and say, we want out. We want to have the chance to say we want out, because then Ottawa has to go, holy crap, it's time to get there and start to get shovels in the ground and actually build these pipelines, talk to the issues that are going on in our country, because if only 40% come out and say it, they want out, nothing changes.
Nothing changes.
And then we sit here and we could talk about all the limited hangouts and everything else, but we go, we have a serious problem here.
Yes.
And most people are going to leave that are thinking like us.
Yes.
And they're going to leave to different countries.
Yes.
And they're going to probably find out there's problems there too.
Yep.
And then they have to start all over again, and maybe they just decide not to worry about it because they got their freedoms. You know, in the United States, you got your First Amendment, your Second Amendment, all the big amendments they talk about, but they're under attack too.
They are, and you know what is that we've actually had like these conversations, like internally as a family, we've had these conversations internally within my community of businesses and contractors that I talk to. We all have like that. We're talking about the same things. We're talking about is that long term, how much longer does our company have? Like, you know, if things don't change, if economics don't change, how long do we have? And this comes back to the housing strategy. You know, we're short. The figures that I just read were CMHC came out with revised figures. They need to build annually, we need 430,000 new housing starts every single year until 2035 in order to catch up on housing and make it affordable.
Yeah, good luck.
Okay.
That isn't happening. And we just have to hear 10 seconds of your story and how much the government regulations are stopping you from building that. And you go, you're not the only one.
No, and I'm not. So this is economically, I think what is driving Alberta independence, it's the economic issue, right? The economics of it.
I think it's a perfect storm. I think it's economics. It's values.
Yes, it's all
right?
of it.
It's all the totalitarian control, do it our way, the centralization.
All of it.
Or, right? And so, like, the economics, you can go off on, certainly, because it's very evident and people understand it and are
Yes.
living it.
And yes, and we see that right here, like we're talking about here in Manitoba and our housing strategy and everything else that's going on there, is that our government is disconnected from the platforms that would actually make changes in Canada. They are, so when we look at what's driving all of this unhappiness and all this frustration in every region of Canada, and driving the economic destabilization that's occurring, and the lack of investment in Canada, and the lack of everything, and infrastructure that is deteriorating. So what's happening is that there is a very big disconnect between the federal government. There is a big disconnect. Federal government, CMHC, lenders, municipalities, and building authorities. That disconnect is evident across Canada. That disconnect is something that we've experienced firsthand in terms of that. And they talk about you need these new housing starts. And as long as we don't have those new housing starts, the tensions that are occurring in every single area of Canada are going to skyrocket, because as people don't have a place to live, as they don't have affordable living, they don't have a chance for their children to work. My nephew is in Vancouver. He is 23 years old. He is going to Simon Fraser University, and he hasn't been able to get a job for 3 years. 3 years. He's volunteering everywhere. He is doing whatever he can, but he can't get a job.
Let me ask you then. Let's turn it here to something that I'm curious about, because once again I'm not a Manitoban. Being from Saskatchewan, we've poked a lot of fun at Manitoba, and then I come here and I'm like, man, there's like a lot of cool stuff going on in Manitoba, which kind of surprises me. In one sense, and yet, like, some of the coolest stories from the Freedom Convoy stemmed around the Winnipeg area, right?
Yeah.
So, in order to get people working, you need projects, you need to build things.
Yeah.
And in my mind, and I'm sure in your mind, it's like, well, let's build things with a purpose.
Yep.
That actually have a return on investment. And so this comes back to the conversation I had with Carly Friesen when we got talking about Churchill.
Yep.
Deepwater Port, check. We need that.
Yep.
And then you get talking about the tourist and all the things they could do there. And I kept saying, and I'm going to butcher this, but something along, one of a kind in Canada. And she's like, no, you don't understand. It's one of a kind in the world.
Yep.
And I'm like, if I believe her, it's one of a kind in the world, what Churchill offers, then there's a project that Manitoba could build. Now, I understand there's going to be all these, you were showing me the map. Yep. And the amount of water and probably marshland and all the swamp and everything, I'm like, don't get me wrong, this is not a small project. Sorry, Manitobans, I'm not trying to make it out to be a small project. Just go look at a map if you're not from Manitoba and you'll realize this isn't a small project. But what sits at the end is a one-of-a-kind in the world.
Yes.
With a deepwater port access that could ship out everything to the world, on and on it goes.
Yeah. And
your construction, so this is why I'm going to ask you.
Yep.
As a lady who's from here and knows all the history, is it possible to build a way to get there that isn't fly in, fly out?
Yes.
That isn't take a 24-hour train and all the things?
We could do it. Absolutely, we could do it. If you look at the scope of the Manitoba hydro projects that have happened, we have diverted entire river systems in northern Manitoba, created the Churchill River diversion, good or bad, but we created it. We created and built mega projects along both sides of our province. We're all hydroelectric power, dams. That means is that you need to build infrastructure.
So you're saying, in a way, they talk about getting off of, and I hate to even utter these words, but oil and gas or coal for powering homes and everything. You could build out a project where you take, because if you diverted water and created dams, major projects, I think it's Paraguay, where they have one of the largest, if not the largest, dams in the world, and they sell their power to Brazil and other neighboring countries. You think in a country that's trying to divert their energy consumption of oil and gas or coal, you sit in a province where you're like, well, if you made a major project going to Churchill, which would be a tourist destination, not to mention the Deepwater Port access,
And
not to mention a whole bunch of other things.
resource movement.
Right. You could actually build something out that would have major projects that would divert a crazy amount of water. And you could, in theory, have a ton of power to sell or help with different provinces or to the south, per se.
Manitoba has either the same or more hydroelectric power as Quebec. Now, Quebec generates a surplus in their hydroelectric power, and technically Manitoba does too. But it's a little bit more complex in the nuances to how that works. And we sell power. We sell power to Ontario. We sell power to Saskatchewan. We sell power to the United States. But our infrastructure hasn't been totally developed. Now, it's closer now that we have the converter station at Bipole. So that's Kiwatnuk. And then we have the Kias Dam, which was just finished in 2019-20 when it came online. And that's a project that I worked on. And I did the water treatment plant at the converter station. And I worked it through Gillam and Split Lake and all the way down the line, all those other areas where we had major dam projects that came along all that way. It's funny, I was a little girl and my stepfather was working as a tradesperson at Limestone Dam. And then the converter station is up at Sundance, which is interesting because my name ties into that. And then I worked on Wasquatum, and then I worked on Kiosk, and then I worked on Kiwatnuk. So it's kind of like generational, tradespersons and families working on the same projects across multiple generations. That's kind of like Manitoba has that ability to be able to do that. We have incredible potential. Like there is so much that Manitoba can offer.
Sure.
In terms of mining, forestry, hydroelectric power, and then on the farming side of it, and then you have the Enbridge line that comes through part of Manitoba. So it's not like Manitoba isn't a logical hub. It is a logical hub to move resources from Western Canada out and from Western Canada to Eastern Canada. It makes sense. But the problem is that we haven't been able to realize that potential. And we haven't been able to make the gains that are necessary to do that. The Port of Churchill makes sense. It makes perfect sense to be able to have the Port of Churchill. And it would probably give Northwest Ontario and Alberta and Saskatchewan some much needed diversity in terms of how they transport their goods to market. It makes sense to be able to do that. But I showed you where the road ends.
Yeah, I did.
And I showed you
so
where the rail line is.
So that's why I come to a construction person and people go, "Oh, it'll be way too difficult."
And
I go,
it's no.
Way too difficult. I was just in Panama and seeing the Panama Canal. You don't think that was difficult?
Yeah.
Like that was difficult. But somebody had a vision of like, we can do this. And were there problems? And will there be problems?
Yes.
Most certainly.
But
I look at it and
doable.
I hear one woman tell me there's nowhere in the world that has Churchill and you can swim with the beluga whales. And, well, I mean, Carly swam with the beluga whales, whether, the world would let you do that, I have no idea. But polar bears, right? You're talking about things that you're just like, Deepwater Port access, all the things, you're like, not to mention, we got looking into it. There's now cruises that go, Hudson Bay cruises. I'm like, what Canadian has ever said, "Oh, I'm going on a Hudson Bay cruise"? I don't think I've ever heard that uttered in my life. And yet there it sits in the middle of the country that you could actually do it. I assume you're going to pay a small fortune, which means most of us aren't going to do it because we can't afford it. But that could become a major hub of tourist destination. We see it out in Alberta. We see it in Banff and Jasper and all the amount of tourists that come through. You go like, that could become a destination hub. So you have to have the vision to do it. So then you go, well, it'll be difficult and the terrain and everything. It's like, Well, yeah, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I
And-
don't think the Panama Canal was easy.
But you know what? It's doable. The thing is, it is doable. There is a rail line that already goes through there. So in terms of environmental impact and things like that, you would have to build it alongside the existing rail that goes up there, because that point of access is already there. So you would have to build up from the rail line and come off the main road and follow that rail line already. I'm probably one of the few people, like I know of kind of like in my generation, where I have actually been on, I was on a 5-seater plane, and I was able to, on that, during major flooding in 2000 and, oh my goodness, 2017, I want to say, when we had big flooding in Manitoba, and we had major northern flooding, where some of our rivers actually flowed backwards and things like that off the Missy Falls at one of the hydro dams and that. So I was actually able to go from Gillam, Manitoba, up to South Indian Lake and watch all of the flow of the water all the way out. We went to past Kias from the Kias Dam, and we went up most of the way up towards Churchill, and then we came down across. I got to see a perspective of northern Manitoba that so few people actually get to see, because I was on we were on a fact-finding mission, and
Sure.
I was hired to be able to go up and document what it was that I saw during the flooding and
And what
things like
did you
that.
see during the flooding years?
Oh my
Or
goodness.
the flooding?
Well, we saw the flooding and how it had wiped out the volume of water that had wiped out a number of traditional areas, like traditional hunting areas, hunting caps, but it also wiped out access to communities, wiped out part of the rail line. Those things occurred, and it did damage to a number of the First Nations that were downstream of where that water came from, and it had impacts going all the way down to Norway House. So it had a huge impact at the time, and so communities were, as they were being flooded, they had access. They needed clean drinking water, a number of things. We had boil water advisories going on, emergency resources management was out, because we had to do shoreline protection with sandbags, a number of things. Homes had to be protected. So I got to see like the long term, like that big picture impact, but I got to see the incredible potential and that beauty of northern Manitoba. Like, people ask why do Indigenous people live in these areas? Well, they were moved there after the fact in many situations, unless they were on a major trading route like York Landing and Fox Lake and Split Lake. Those have thousands of years. Those communities have existed in one form or another. But it is incredibly beautiful. Like, when you go up to northern Manitoba and you fly into one of these communities and you just leave all the other stuff aside, and the politics and the poverty and the economics.
Leave the world's problems behind.
And then you sit down and you get out on a machine, whether it's a snowmobile, or you get out on the boat, and then you just look, or you're flying into that community, and you're like, holy smokes, this is beautiful. Life slows down.
Yeah.
Life slows down.
I've been to we've flown in northern Saskatchewan the same way. Cell phones don't work.
Yeah.
This is perfect.
Yeah. So your life.
That's a few years back now, but
it's different. So I look at that, and we have this. So what's the problem? This comes down to what I said before, is that there is a disconnect, a political will disconnect, and the funding disconnect, and the approvals disconnect.
Yeah, you wonder if any one man or woman could ever get in there and change that, or
they could. It absolutely could. So if it was a drive to have it happen, it can absolutely happen. I've seen what Manitoba Hydro's done. Manitoba Hydro, when you're talking about clearing out and creating something that didn't exist, can it be done? Yes,
absolutely,
it absolutely could be done. You see mining operations anything can be done.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, so when people are like, "Wow, it's a lot of water, this type of land," and I'm like, man, the amount of machinery and ingenuity we have, if we just let people go off and
expensive.
Oh, sure,
it'll be expensive.
Sure, but can you imagine if Manitoba set off and like government projects, so certainly, it's going to be expensive. But I mean, if all of a sudden they said over the course of the next 10 years, 20 years, we're going to build out the infrastructure to open up Churchill. And what we're asking from the government of Canada and from Alberta and maybe Saskatchewan and who knows, maybe parts of Ontario, in order to do this, we need some investment from your provinces.
Yep.
And we'll cover the other 50%, whatever it is. And it's going to cost $100 billion. I don't know. I'm picking a number out of thin air. But in 10 or 20 years, we're going to have the port completely open. And do I wish it was 2 years? Everybody wishes it was 2 years. But this is where we're going to build to.
Yep.
And in time, it'll become the hub of not only trade going out through the Churchill, but people coming and a thriving business for Manitoba. And oh, wait, Alberta, you're going to be able to get your stuff out. Saskatchewan, you're going to be able to get your stuff out. Like, to me, that just makes logical sense. But in Canada, no matter, the more things make logical sense, the less I believe it will be done.
Yes.
Like, I don't think there's, until I ran into the conversation with Carly Friesen, I would have never even thought of it.
Yeah.
Just think of the Churchill being up there, and that's a big lake and whatever.
You look at that, what you have in Churchill, you have through along parts of Nunavut with some of their deep water ports, and what the federal government has spent in order to bring year-round access to those ports. I mean, I've watched some of the projects that have gone into Nunavut, and it's an incredible amount of engineering and resources that were brought to create those deep water ports and shore them up and be able to do, because you're dealing with tides on a level that's crazy. Like, Hudson's Bay is one thing, but you go further up on the Nunavut coastlines and those ports, and that's crazy in terms of what they've had to deal with in order to create these deep water ports. So it's 100% doable. It's we can do this. The problem is that it needs to be coordinated, and you need to figure out how you're going to fund it, and you need to start putting.
You need some political will to do it.
And that means
maybe a little bit of vision of where you want to go.
So instead of us putting all of this money in other nations, what if we invested it in our own country first?
We need to help all the other countries get out of their. We need transgender bathrooms everywhere.
But again, I mean, this will come down to an Indigenous issue: is that how many First Nations now are saying, and in fact, one of the recent court rulings that I just read, what was one of the arguments that the First Nations said in that particular court case? And that was actually about, I think it was a housing issue. They said the argument they made was that we feel that our rights have been violated, and that these treaty arrangements have been violated because we have been placed as a low priority, and we are funding other countries, and we're funding other groups, maybe disadvantaged groups, but other groups ahead of Indigenous commitments that the federal government has made and not adhered to. Now, in the particular case of this ruling, the court said is that there's not enough evidence at this point in time to say that was actually done in a discriminatory fashion. And maybe rightly so, that the evidence wasn't there, but the perspective exists. The perception exists among Indigenous that the Indigenous issues are a low priority, and that our federal government would rather send those dollars overseas than make the commitments that they have here. And it's funny because Indigenous communities are also huge supporters of the Canadian military and service, and we have so many veterans that have come from these communities, and one of the things they cite is look at the lack of funding going to veterans groups and veterans affairs, and they cited that in their arguments, is that they didn't say that they felt it was just Indigenous groups. They cited other groups in that argument that pointed out that we're also feeling the same lack of priority. And I think that other Canadians, and I know that Quebec litigators and constitutional lawyers actually follow what Indigenous groups do, because Indigenous lawyers And any lawyers, Indigenous or not, that are fighting the constitutional battles are actually laying ground for Canadians as a whole, because is there one group of Canadians that force the federal government to follow the rules? It's Indigenous groups, it's in First Nations, because they force them to do it.
We've been talking for a while, and I'm getting text of I'm on supper duty tonight, so
I didn't even know how long we started talking.
Well, it's 5:30 right now, so Mel's starting to go. Listeners getting a nice look in at life on the road. I'm on cooking duty tonight. One final question for you that I've been ending, because we talked about independence, is do you have a favorite memory of a road trip or a camping trip, whether it was when you were a child or as a mother or now as a grandmother? Is there anything that sticks out to you from life on the road?
Yeah, we would take our kids down south every year. I'd pull the kids out of school for 5 weeks every year. And the one particular trip that we did that was just amazing was when we drove from here in the winter, December. And we went from here to Vancouver. And then we went from Vancouver to Victoria Island, got to go through all of Victoria Island that we could get to, and then go through the redwoods and everything on Victoria Island, and then go down the cedars, that old growth forest, and then we drove all the way down from Vancouver, all the way down to like Ventura, Point Arena, San Francisco, LA, and then we went across. And then we went across the states, and then we went down to South Padre Island. And my kids were about the same age as yours when we went. And we had so many ups and downs in there on the trip. And we were pulling an RV. Like so we were pulling the RV, and we had some breakdowns. We had other things and that. But what I looked at that trip about is that the time that I got to spend with my kids and the bonds that I made with my kids still talk about it. But all of that aside is that quality time, it's how much my kids learned, and how much it was imprinted on them in terms of being able to see different places and meet different people. And we went off the beaten path all over the place. And we were listening to radio and stuff like that. And I remember we're traveling, listening to George Norrie and Coast to Coast and that with the boys in the vehicle. And as we're driving through different parts of the country and stuff like that, and listening to that's the radio access that we had in different places. And that was a cool experience, because we took our kids just everywhere that we wanted to go to. And it didn't matter to us, the time out of school or anything like that, right? It was about that quality time, and it was about bonding as a family and giving them a perspective that other kids were going to have, and their friends have said to them. And even like Tasha, my daughter-in-law, when she hears the stories of where we took the boys, and particularly that trip, and she said, I'd never been out of Manitoba, and we never got to do stuff like that with my parents as a kid. And how many of their friends had never done that. They'd never been out of their province. And we did that. And our boys learned about people, perspective, politics, new geography. And they gained something else, I think, and that was the ability to question. Because they've seen a lot. And so now they are at their age, 26 and 28, they can ask questions. And people say different things and that, my parents took me there when I was little, and I didn't see it that way. Or they just knew, they learned enough being on the road, meeting different people to learn that they could ask a question. And that was amazing. And I said earlier, is that if I had a chance to do it again, would I have started my company, or would I maybe have taken my boys and done more traveling? If I had the ability to go back and do it again, I might choose taking my kids on traveling instead, working, but traveling and doing that. And with the work that I do and the work that my husband does, we could have done that. We could have done that and given them something a little bit different. And maybe things would change, and maybe I wouldn't have the grandbabies that I have now. But
the thing about it is you can't go back, right?
yeah,
You know?
But I am so thankful that I took the opportunity to do that. So right now, you're going to find like your kids are that age that everything that you experience on the road with your wife and with your kids, you will still be talking about this 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And when your kids are now 25, 26, 27, 28 years old, and they're talking to their partners, they're going to talk about this. They're going to remember it. And that to me is like, okay, is there one thing that I did for my kids that gave them like this huge...
Yeah, a core memory.
This is it.
That's one of the things that's come up when I've asked this question, is that whether I'd thought about it, which I hadn't, is you're imprinting a core memory on them. And how lucky to be able to do something like that.
It will shape them. You may not realize, I've had how many years to look back at how it shaped my kids, but it will absolutely shape them for years to come, and you won't see it right away. But then it'll start creeping into it as they start getting into their teens and things like that. The impact of what you do today, that is when you're going to see it.
Well, I know that when we biked across the country 20 years ago, now that was a physical feat for myself that was very confidence building. But seeing the country, every time they say hate the East, I'm like, man, the nicest person I met biking Canada, Ottawa. So as much as I dislike the current government, I can never be influenced enough to hate the other side of the country.
Yes.
It doesn't make any sense to me because I've been across the country.
Yeah.
In saying that, it's been 20 years. And I wonder how much the country has changed. And that's what I look forward to seeing for myself in my eyes.
Yeah.
But either way, I appreciate you doing this. We've been going for a while. And I don't know, it's like it's fun to get to your neck of the woods, see what you're building here. And we didn't get a whole lot into that.
And so I want to talk about that. Like, let's set up something where I can talk about, because that's a whole nother serious issue, and it's important because it drives another question that we didn't get to talk about. Now is about businesses leaving Canada. And I would really love to dig into that.
To dig into that. Well, we'll have to make time for it. But either way, for this time, Jocelyn, I appreciate you hopping on and doing this and showing us around and just, I don't know, getting to be in your territory and see how things go here. And you have not disappointed, although I knew all about you well before I sat down. It's just cool to finally meet you in person and get to converse like this.
Yeah, I had a blast. This was fun. I really look forward to it, and so I'm glad we did it.
Well, thank you.